Hi, everyone. Welcome to Stat Chasing Week 12. If you have not listened to the show before, this is where I go through all the stats that I think are especially important to kind of lay a foundation of what happened this past week and then get a jump on the research for this coming week. Kind of is the foundation layer where I can layer on top everyone else's thoughts for the coming week. The stats that I'll be using for this are from PFF, yards per route run, targets per route run. I think these are especially useful for wide receivers and tight ends. I also get dropbacks per team and routes run there from PFF as well. And then RotoViz is where I get air yards data, target share, air yard share, all that good stuff. And Josh Hermsmeyer's Whopper metric, which combines air yard share and target share. That's also where I get average depth of target, or ADOT. And RotoViz is also where I get expected points, which weights opportunities by the line of scrimmage, which is especially useful for establishing running back workloads. There's also a stat that I've been using from Ben Gretch, weighted targets per route run, which incorporates air yards into the target per route run formula. It scales similarly to Whopper on that 0 to 1 scale. It's a really cool stat, especially useful when you've got guys who are like coming back from injury or working into bigger roles, or young players. Can help identify the guys who are really popping on that per route basis. Ben also uses the term green zone in his work at Stealing Signals, which I'm also going to use, and that's the area of the field inside the 10-yard line. Touches coming within the green zone are high-value touches. So those are both from Ben Gretch and Stealing Signals. Speaking of Ben, he and I have started a show that's airing on Fridays at 4 p.m. Eastern called Chasing Signals. You can check that out here on the YouTube channel. We did that last week. We're going to be doing it again, and the format will be a little bit different this week. So check that out. I'm pretty excited about the twist that we're making to the show going forward. The other stat that I'll mention is snaps here, and that comes from Pro Football Reference. Couple shout outs. Change College at Change College on Twitter does timestamps for each of the teams in the comments below, which is awesome. So thank you to him. Steven Krupka does highlight videos for each week of stat chasing that I've been sharing on Twitter. Those are really, really cool. And you can follow him at Ball Street FF. Sam Hoppin creates charts for each of these teams. I'll bring that up now. Sam is on Twitter at Sam Hoppin. He does all these really cool visualizations and has created these to help out for the YouTube. I'll talk through this now quickly. I won't be talking through every team here as we go, but just so you get a sense for how these charts are set up. Targets per route run is on the x-axis. Routes per team dropback is on the y-axis. The air yards, the size of the air yards is the size of the bubble, and also the air yards are written in parentheses. Normally what we're looking for is guys who are showing up in the top right where DeAndre Hopkins almost is. He usually is in this kind of desirable area of the chart. Didn't quite make it this week because he wasn't targeted as heavily as we're used to seeing. Christian Kirk is in a similar boat where he ran a lot of routes, not targeted as much as we're used to seeing. Guys who are down here in this range can often be interesting. They're the type of dudes who've been targeted on a very high percentage of their routes, but aren't running a full slate of routes. Chase Edmonds is actually a decent example, because if Kenyon Drake were to give up a bunch of his routes to Chase Edmonds, and you can see Kenyon Drake running a similar amount but targeted at a lower rate, then Chase Edmonds would be pretty exciting, pretty interesting if he were in the full-time role. So we'll go ahead and jump into Arizona here, starting with the running back position. So Kenyon Drake played 55% of the snaps this week. He had 29 expected points, which is a pretty huge workload. That was driven by green zone carries. He had 7 of those. He converted 2 for touchdowns. He did have one of those carries that did not go for a touchdown look like it might have been changed to a touchdown. If it had been challenged, it was not. So that looks like he's less efficient because he didn't convert a short carry. And so he left 4.7 points on the field, according to fantasy points over expected from RotoViz. And, that is partially due to him having, not getting the benefit of that challenge. But that's also creating a bigger expected points workload than he would have had if, he only has 6 green zone carries instead of 7. So Drake, workload probably a little bit inflated by that decision. His inefficiency was also a little bit overstated due to that decision not to challenge again. I'm assuming it would have been a touchdown if they had challenged it. He was pretty involved in the passing game here, which is interesting. I mentioned as I went over the chart here that Kenyon Drake, and ran a similar, the exact same amount of route percentage as Chase Edmonds. So pretty decently involved as a receiver, 4 targets, had 3 receptions for 15 yards. That's nice to see. As far as the workload goes, obviously you're not going to expect the workload to be nearly this big most weeks, but I do wonder if Kyler, with his shoulder, maybe running a little bit less, and that could help Kenyon Drake if he's operating more like a traditional running back in this offense. Chase Edmonds looking like the clear 1B when this offense is in competitive scripts. He was out there for 45% of snaps, had a 10.1 expected points workload, which isn't bad. Fantasy points over expectation of minus 1.8, so also a little bit inefficient on the day. But again, didn't have the clear lead over Drake in the passing game this week. Had 5 targets, went for 4 for 14. So could have been a bigger day if he did more with his passing game work. In terms of the wide receivers, DeAndre Hopkins ran a route on 97% of dropbacks. He had 21% target share, 25% air yard share, and a 0.49 Whopper in his typical intermediate role with an ADOT of 8.3, but just wasn't earning targets at the same rate that we're used to. Got targeted on 18% of his routes. Okay weighted targets per route run of 0.43. So, just not as dominant as he usually is. Could be the Bill Belichick effect. I'm not sure, but nothing I'm too worried about. These are kind of what count as floor games for DeAndre Hopkins, where he still has solid volume, just not dominant volume. Christian Kirk in this game ran around on 92% of dropbacks. He had 18% of the targets, 34% of the air yards, so a little bit of a better Whopper than Hopkins with 0.5 Whopper. He was in his typical role as well with a 13 ADOT. However, he was very inefficient in this game with a 3.2 yards per target, dropped the touchdown. The volume was here for a big day, but didn't materialize due to that inefficiency on a per target basis. That's something that's going to happen with the deeper threat guys like Kirk is. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that. Andy Isabella saw a nice jump in volume here. He ran a route on 69% of dropbacks. So, with Larry Fitzgerald out, he did in fact see a big jump in routes, but he hasn't been getting targeted at a high rate recently, and he wasn't really targeted at a high rate in this game either. Weighted target per route run of 0.34, which isn't great. Also, yards per target of just 6.6, and interestingly, an ADOT of 1.8. So not really the deep threat that we would have expected here. He's taking over from Larry Fitzgerald. So Larry Fitzgerald, obviously not a deep threat, but I think this is probably just kind of variance that Andy Isabella wasn't getting open potentially deeper because not what we would expect for Andy Isabella. Definitely interesting to note that Keyshawn Johnson only ran around on 13% of dropbacks. So Andy Isabella way ahead of Johnson, which is important to note if Fitzgerald ever ends up missing again, that I think Andy Isabella does own this slot role over Keyshawn Johnson or anyone else. Dan Arnold in this game ran a route on 54% of dropbacks. He was targeted on 10% of his routes, which is pretty damn low, and had a strangely high ADOT of 18.7, kind of getting some of those deeper intermediate or deeper middle of the field targets that Isabella wasn't getting. He ended up with 24% of the air yards as a result, but not someone that I'm really ever that interested in. He is splitting a role with Max Williams, who ran around on 41% of dropbacks. So tough to really trust any Arizona tight end. In Atlanta, Brian Hill was the lead back here, but not as much as we would have expected. Played 50% of the snaps to Ito Smith's 36%, but he only had 8 expected points to Ito Smith's 15.5. Why the discrepancy? Well, one, Ito Smith got 5 targets to Brian Hill's 1. But Ito Smith also had the green zone work. He got a green zone target and he had a green zone rush, which he scored on. That led to an efficient day for Ito Smith, gaining 2 points over expected. Brian Hill left 2.5 points on the field. So all in all, this was an Ito Smith day. The targets here were not backed up by the route run percentage. Both of these guys ran a route on 34% of dropbacks. So they had identical routes run, but Ito Smith with a much bigger target. So, Ito Smith is the type of guy that you would expect to get targeted at a higher rate, but I don't think the 5 targets are really something we can count on, even if Todd Gurley misses again. But interesting that he got the red zone work. Certainly makes Brian Hill very tough to trust going forward, even though he did have the snap lead. So Ito Smith probably the better bet of the two, but it's not obvious. As you might expect that it would be obvious given the expected points differential. So we'll have to see if Todd Gurley misses again. Keep an eye on the practice reports there, but it's going to be tough to predict between the two. I probably would lean Ito Smith, but it wouldn't be crazy for Hill to kind of bounce back with a much bigger workload given the lead in snaps and the tie in routes. Moving to wide receiver, Calvin Ridley ran a route on 90% of dropbacks. He had a target share of 24%, an air yard share of 32%, and a whopper of 0.59. So a pretty nice day for Calvin Ridley in terms of the volume. He did have a touchdown, but wasn't quite as big of a day as I thought it might be with Julio Jones out. Russell Gage had a pretty strong day in terms of the volume too, especially with the routes run, where he ran around on 95% of dropbacks. Didn't earn targets at a very high rate, only 13% target per route run, 14% target share, 19% air yard share, an okay whopper of 0.34, not great. So really, he was out there all the time, but didn't earn a ton of volume, had 5 targets in this game, went 3 for 34. Interestingly, Christian Blake was the wide receiver 3 in this game. I would have thought it was Olamide Zaccheaus, but I've gotten burned enough times here with the Falcons to be too confident in predicting how they're going to play things when Julio or Ridley is out. But Zaccheaus has typically been in the Julio role. Christian Blake has typically backed up the Calvin Ridley role. Calvin Ridley was in his typical role. He had an 8 out of 7.6. He was not in that deep threat Julio role. So Calvin Ridley, usually high volume, but more intermediate range. And that's, what we normally see from Julio is that he's a deeper threat, also high volume. And then when he misses, what we have seen in the past is that Zaccheaus comes in and plays kind of a deep threat role and doesn't get nearly the target volume. That is what happened as far as Zaccheaus' part. He was out there on only 22% of the dropbacks, though, with the 16.3 ADOT. So he was playing that deep threat role, but only came away with 3 targets because he wasn't out there a ton. Christian Blake was out there quite a bit more, ran around on 49% of dropbacks. He was only targeted on 5% of his routes, which is 3% target share, 6% air yard share, a whopper of 0.08, really gross, just 1 target. He did catch that target for 17 yards. So, good yards per target, but didn't earn any more than 1 target, an 8 out of 12. So tough to say what his role really was, given that he just got the 1 target. But interesting that he was out there so much. Would have thought we would have gotten more from Zaccheaus. And then also interesting, Brandon Powell was out there for 20% of the routes. He typically backs up Russell Gage, so he also got mixed in. So it's getting tougher and tougher to really count on any of these Atlanta secondary wide receivers. What is locked in is that Russell Gage is definitely the wide receiver 3. He graduates to the wide receiver 2, I think, when either Ridley or Julio's out. And then I also think it helps Hayden Hurst to have one of these top wide receivers out because he earns targets typically at a much higher rate. This week, earning targets on 30% of his routes, which is an elite mark for a tight end, had an 8 out of just 4.6. But when you're getting targeted that much, that's okay. He had a whopper on the day of 0.45, which is pretty strong. Yards per target of only 6, went 4 for 48 on 8 targets. So not the biggest day, but definitely had some nice volume here. Moving to Buffalo, Zach Moss was the leader in the backfield this week. He had 60% of the snaps, to 40% for Devin Singletary, but the workloads were pretty even. In fact, Singletary led. He had 8.4 expected points to 7.8 for Moss. Moss got the one green zone carry this game. He did not convert it, but he still was slightly efficient on the day, adding a point in efficiency. Singletary did not get any green zone carries or green zone targets, but he did add 4.8 points in efficiency to his workload. He went 3 for 20 on 3 targets. He had 82 rushing yards on 11 attempts. So pretty strong day for Devin Singletary, but he did lose a fumble. So that's obviously not great. The interesting thing that jumps out to me here is that, Singletary had the stronger day, but again, the 60-40 split in snaps favoring Moss definitely points me to looking at Moss going forward. And then Moss also ran a route on 61% of dropbacks to 32% for Singletary. So Singletary with the 3 targets to Moss's 2, obviously targeted at a higher rate, but Moss ran a route on 46% of his snaps to 36% for Singletary. So you would think Singletary would be kind of more the passing down, passing situation back. That wasn't really the case this week. Moss running a lot of routes overall, running a lot of routes when, per snap. So, his role kind of tilted a bit more towards pass catching than we would have expected. All in all, I think some of the underlying numbers actually pointing towards Moss here, despite the workload being even this week. And he is the running back that I prefer going forward. Moving to wide receiver, Stephon Diggs. He had massive volume this week. However, inefficiency on a per target basis prevented a spike week. He had ran around 100% of dropbacks, had 38% of the targets, 42% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.86. All very, very strong numbers. But then, we get to the yards per target of 4.3, led to a yards per route run of 1.39, which is not great. So it's just a bit disappointing that the yards per target inefficiency really tanked what could have been a huge day for Diggs. Gabriel Davis, you can see Diggs on the chart here, by the way. This is exactly where we want to see guys, but just didn't deliver on the per target efficiency. That's the thing we want to fade. We want to fade the per target efficiency and chase the underlying volume. Gabriel Davis ran a route here on 100% of dropbacks as well, targeted on a much lower percentage of his routes, only 11% target per route run. You see Diggs at 32%. However, Davis made up for that with air yards. You can see 66% of the air yards in this game, and as a result had a whopper of 0.71, which is a wide receiver 1 type of whopper. And he was really awesome on his targets with 26.3 yards per target in this game, leading to a yards per route run of 2.82. So really strong day from Davis, connecting on some big plays. Also got in the end zone. The thing with Davis, right, this yards per target, I just said, we're not chasing that. That's fine. But what you have to keep in mind with Davis is that John Brown is 1 on IR, and 2, he's a cut candidate in the offseason. I've mentioned this a few times, but worth reiterating here that if John Brown gets cut, Gabriel Davis is stepping into a pretty big role here, and one where he can have nice days. And the yards per target, I do think the fact that he's making plays would make it more likely that the team ultimately does feel confident enough in him to go ahead and move forward with Gabriel Davis as the wide receiver 2 going forward. And with the way this team is passing, that would be very, very exciting. So, maybe wait for Gabriel Davis to cool off a bit, but this is roughly the time, and we've got trade deadlines coming up, right? So if it hasn't already, so you gotta make your move here on Gabriel Davis if you still have a trade deadline that hasn't passed yet. Cole Beasley in this game, he ran a route on 93% of dropbacks, 17% target share, 10% air yard share, a whopper of 0.32. Beasley is a slot receiver, and he ran a route on 93% of dropbacks. That's pretty ridiculous for a guy who's playing in the slot. Lower than ideal whopper this week of 0.32, but it's interesting that Beasley's out there as much as he is. We're even seeing when John Brown was healthy, this team was running a lot of 4 wide receiver sets. So they're passing out of 3 wide receivers basically all the time, and they don't really rotate their wide receivers. Isaiah McKenzie only ran around on 14% of dropbacks. It was really concentrated this volume to these 3 wide receivers. We're also not losing a lot here to tight ends, with Dawson Knox running around on 61% of dropbacks, but only targeted on 12% of his routes. He got in the end zone here, but that was his only target of the day. So not even someone that we can trust when Tyler Kroft isn't playing, which he did miss this game. So, if you took a stab on Dawson Knox, it paid off because of the touchdown, but the tight end is just something I don't think it's really worth taking a flyer on here, just because the target volume does not tend to be there. Moving to Carolina, we had Mike Davis in this game take a bit of a step back in terms of his snaps, with 57% snaps. He did have a pretty nice workload, 17.2 expected points, but left 6.3 points on the field here. Did not convert on 2 separate green zone carries. That's partially explaining that inefficiency. Also only had 3 receptions on 6 targets, went for 24 yards on those. So that helps explain why he was inefficient on the day, but pretty nice workload. However, losing a lot of snaps to Rodney Smith at 23% and Trenton Cannon at 15%. I think just kind of a sign that even if he played well earlier when McCaffrey was out, he's no threat to McCaffrey once McCaffrey gets back. At this point, I really would confidently say that McCaffrey will have his full role back once he's healthy, hopefully after the bye. At wide receiver, Robbie Anderson, first of all, he could be stepping into a much bigger role. The first thing to cover here is that DJ Moore is injured. Teddy Bridgewater missed him so bad on an easy open touchdown throw that he almost broke his ankle. It was awful. And luckily he's not seriously injured. X-rays are negative, but it's not clear that he will be back soon. I would say he seems doubtful to return after the week 13 bye. Hopefully he'll play week 14, but I'm not counting on it. And, if not, Robbie Anderson is going to inherit a pretty big role. DJ Moore, he had a 28% target share in this game, running around on 89% of dropbacks, air yard share of 43%, the ADOT of 14.3 that we've come to expect now with DJ Moore when Teddy Bridgewater's out there kind of operating as the deep threat typically. And he had a whopper of 0.72. Again, the per target efficiency for DJ Moore, not great, 6.8, but that has more to do with Bridgewater than DJ Moore, I think. Robbie Anderson also had a pretty strong day. So with this volume freeing up from Moore, that's why, I keep saying that this could be really bullish for Anderson if Moore misses time. Anderson ran around on 89% of dropbacks, had a target share of 22%, air yard share of 42%, whopper of 0.62. He was efficient on the day with the yards per target of 13.4. And the interesting thing for Anderson, sometimes when these offenses just condense to like one guy, that's not necessarily great for that wide receiver's efficiency. Usually means a high floor, but it can sometimes, I think, hurt a guy's ceiling if there's no one to open up the offense. And DJ Moore had been playing the deep threat role. So in some ways, he was probably helping Robbie Anderson, and Anderson often operating as the 1A, 2 more is 1B in terms of volume. So, wouldn't necessarily be a good thing for him to lose the guy who is opening up the offense. But I do think that Curtis Samuel can probably open up the offense to some degree too. We'll have to see. I'm actually curious to see if Anderson plays a bit of a deeper threat role and Samuel operates more underneath. Anderson in this game had an 8 out of 18.1. Curtis Samuel was only at 6. He ran around on 76% of dropbacks, had a target per route run of 17%, so not targeted at a super high rate. But again, DJ Moore was out there. And Anderson had 16% of the targets, 10% of the air yards, and a whopper of 0.3. Samuel has emerged as a pretty solid contributor. He has a weighted target per route run of 0.44 in the season, which is okay. But yeah, with a fair amount of volume to open up, this will be one of the really interesting situations this week to see if Anderson operates deep like he did this week and like we're used to seeing from DJ Moore, and Curtis Samuel picks up a lot of that volume underneath, or potentially vice versa. But I think both guys are probably going to be interesting in some regard, because there is no one to worry about here from the tight ends, and really from the other wide receivers. Brandon Zylstra had a route run on 29% of dropbacks, didn't get targeted. Ian Thomas ran a route on 79% of dropbacks. He was targeted just twice, went 1 for 4, target per route run of 7%. This is just the story every week with Ian Thomas, just a ton of empty routes. And the other tight ends aren't really even running routes now. Chris Manhertz ran around on 5% of dropbacks, Colin Thompson at 5%. So it really does look like, potentially coming out of the bye, we're looking at Christian McCaffrey, Curtis Samuel, and Robbie Anderson. And all three of these guys could have pretty massive target shares. And Anderson and Samuel could both have massive air yard shares, given that McCaffrey won't really compete there. Moving to Chicago, David Montgomery had a pretty nice game in this one. Clear workhorse again with 85% of snaps. He had a solid workload of 15.6 expected points. Not great. Not bad, but not like a true running back one workload. But he was very efficient on the day, which is not what we're used to saying about David Montgomery. He had 9.7 points added in efficiency. He actually did not convert on his one green zone carry, but he did score a touchdown on his one green zone target. He also added a 57-yard run, which is, again, not a typical David Montgomery thing. He did not score on his long run, which does seem more like what we expect from David Montgomery. But, he did have some burst on that run. He kind of got up to speed quickly, not the dancing type of movement that we're used to seeing. So, pretty strong day overall from David Montgomery. And he is just, he's out there running a ton of routes, ran a route on 74% of dropbacks. He's used pretty extensively in the receiving game, had 6 targets, went 5 for 40 in a touchdown. So, definitely some bullish signs here for David Montgomery, although, the workload is a little bit lower than you'd expect, given the 85% snap rate. At wide receiver, Allen Robinson ran a route on 94% of dropbacks. He had 30% of the targets, 19% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.58. So that's pretty solid. And you can see he's targeted right where we want guys to be targeted. But this air yard bubble here on the chart is not what we'd like. It's a little bit small. His ADOT was only 5.9, so that kind of explains what was going on there, getting targeted a little bit shallower. Also wasn't super efficient in terms of yards per target at 6.2, led to a yards per route run of 1.57, which is pretty mediocre, but did get in the end zone twice, did have 8 receptions for 74 yards, which is what 13 targets will do for you. So not quite an elite wide receiver one volume day, but when you get in the end zone twice, can't complain too much. Darnell Mooney was, again, kind of a deep threat in this game as we're used to seeing, but also not very efficient, which can sometimes happen with these deep threats that I talked about with Kirk. Mooney ran a route on 84% of dropbacks. He had 20% of the targets, 34% of the air yards, pretty nice whopper of 0.55, but had the yards per target of just 3.8 on that deep threat, ADOT of 15.3. That led to a yards per route run of just 0.81, which is not good. Anthony Miller was actually even below that this week in terms of his yards per route run at 0.76. Really not a strong day for Miller with a 4.7 yards per target. Went 3 for 28 on 6 targets. And the underlying volume wasn't all that good as well, with 14% target share, 17% air yards, a whopper of 0.33. So not all that involved. But what I do like to see here is that Anthony Miller was running around on 74% of dropbacks. So the offense sticking with the 3 wide receiver sets instead of the 2 tight end stuff that we were seeing in the beginning of the year. So that at least is bullish for Miller. And especially bullish, I would say, because we're seeing Cole Kmet come on. So luckily for Miller, Cole Kmet is coming on at the expense of Jimmy Graham and not Miller. Cole Kmet ran a route on 66% of dropbacks. Jimmy Graham down to 34%. However, Kmet, if you're looking at him as a potential option, he still looks like very much as kind of a dynasty option right now. 9% target per route run, an 8 out of 10, which is higher than you typically see from a tight end. So that explains some of the low target rate. When guys are running deeper downfield, they're typically not targeted as high at as high of a rate. But Kmet was also bad in terms of his targets. So he had a 2.7 yards per target, yards per route run of 0.24, which is abysmal. When Jimmy Graham is crushing you in yards per route run, that's really bad. Graham had a yards per route run of 1.88. So I don't know. I'm thinking that Kmet is still kind of coming on here. I do think he'll probably stay ahead of Graham, but I wouldn't be surprised at all if this went back closer to 50-50 split. You're not playing either of these guys. But, I would say Kmet's definitely someone I'm interested in Dynasty. He is finally starting to get some run. And probably the guy who's going to be, entering a clear lead as the tight end one next season in Chicago. Moving to Cincinnati, we had Giovanni Bernard come on a little bit here. He had 78% of the snaps this week. I talked about last week how he was way closer to Samaje Perine in snaps than we would have thought. Perine down to 14% snaps this week. So huge change. I actually was wondering if there was an injury I missed here. I don't believe there was. The expected points workload for Giovanni Bernard, though, not good. 7.5 expected points. I was just saying I would like to see more than the 15 plus from Montgomery on the 80+% snaps from him. Well, here we have almost 80% snaps for Gio. He can't even get to 10 expected points. That's really rough. But this is the Brandon Allen-led Cincinnati Bengals, so somewhat to be expected. Bernard wasn't bad in terms of his efficiency, left like half a point, 0.6 points on the field, which, again, given the offense that he's in, that's not bad. Perine mixed in here for 1.4 points. Travion Williams mixed in for 1.8 expected points with 10% of the snaps. So a little bit of a mix here in terms of the running back too. Be interesting for dynasty purposes if we start to see Travion Williams get a little bit more run, but that's really the only thing that we can be interested in this backfield, because I don't see any way you're playing Gio, even with a 78% snap rate. Brandon Allen, just not a quarterback that I want to have the running back for. Moving to wide receiver, this is not going to be good either, right? Because we got Brandon Allen kind of tanking the value of this entire offense, or just not having Joe Burrow, not to put it all on Allen. Tyler Boyd, he ran a route on 94% of dropbacks here, 22% target share, 17% air yard share, Whopper 0.45. Not terrible underlying volume, but the yards per target at 2.5. Yards per route run of 0.48. So rough day in that regard. Just went 3 for 15 on 6 targets. T. Higgins ran a route on 88% of dropbacks. I'd like to see that get up into the 90s at this point. The guy's a stud. Had a target share of 19%, air yard share of 14%, a Whopper of 0.38. One thing I noticed with Higgins is that his ADOT was 5.8, which is a lot lower than you would think. And I think probably a sign of kind of the health of the offense. He did score a touchdown here, went 5 for 44 on 5 targets. So, not a bad day from Higgins, all things considered. And he is like the one piece where you, I think, consider throwing a dart at week to week. It's a little bit like Cortland Sutton last year, where the quarterback play was just a huge concern, but Higgins can play. Like Sutton, Higgins is definitely a future stud. AJ Green here had an ADOT of 25. So just a kind of pure field stretcher here. And, you got to be really sick to want to play AJ Green with Brandon Allen, right? 11% target share, ran a route on 79% of dropbacks, had a Whopper of 0.43 because he did get, a fair amount of the air yards with 37%. So 75 air yards for AJ Green, but those are pretty dead air yards for the most part. At tight end, Drew Sample had a big game in the underlying volume, and actually a decent game overall with 4 for 40 on 5 targets. That's pretty huge considering the circumstances. ran a route on 70% of dropbacks, targeted on 22% of his routes with an 8 out of 6.8. So I would say the fact that Brandon Allen locked on to Drew Sample tells you all you need to know about Brandon Allen's play. Moving to Dallas, Zeke Elliott played 61. Oh, excuse me. I seem to have skipped Cleveland here. Let me see if I can find Cleveland. Here's Cleveland. Okay. Nick Chubb played 61% of the snaps and had a really nice workload of 19.4 expected points. Also played efficiently on that workload, adding 7.2 points in efficiency. So a really nice game from Nick Chubb. Had 3 green zone carries, converted one of those. I will say while he got the workload, only playing 61% of the snaps with Kareem Hunt at 42% is definitely a red flag for his floor. It's Nick Chubb. He's awesome. He can produce a lot on limited snap count. He can get loaded up on limited snap count in the right game scripts. But, definitely keep that in mind that that snap split definitely lowers the floor. But this was a big game, so let's talk about some positives. One, we had that fluky green zone usage last week where Kareem Hunt was getting all the work. That obviously did not seem to be something to take too seriously going forward. We saw that flip right back to Nick Chubb with the 3-1 lead this week. And interestingly enough, Nick Chubb actually ran more routes than Kareem Hunt this week, not targeted at as high of a rate, but actually did lead in targets 3-2. And had 3 receptions for 32 yards in this game, whereas Hunt actually did not catch either of his targets. So kind of interesting to see Chubb leading as a receiver. And if he starts to get worked in a bit more there, then he's definitely going to be someone with a higher floor than you would think, or than we're used to seeing from Nick Chubb. Because when things kind of go wrong for him, it can get ugly. Go wrong for him in terms of the game script. I mean, Kareem Hunt. He played, as I mentioned, 42% of the snaps. He had 8.2 expected points, which is kind of like a backup level workload, not great, and also left 2 points on the field. Had 1 green zone carry, which he did not convert. It's just going to be a kind of a volatile situation here with this true split. It's going to be close to kind of a 50-50 split here. I think it's like one of these guys is kind of Aaron Jones and the other is Jamal Williams, but we don't really know who is who going in. Is maybe one way to think about it. It's going to be a little bit frustrating, a little bit volatile. But, Nick Chubb was a guy I played a little bit in DFS, and that was a guy the ETR dudes were talking up a lot. Ended up being a pretty good call. And I think that in that sense, the volatility can play to your favor because people are going to be scared to want to play these guys because it's very unpredictable. But the ceiling can be there as well as a pretty low floor. At wide receiver, Jarvis Landry, he ran around 66% of dropbacks. He had a target per route run of 52%, just targeted on an absurdly high rate. You see him on the chart here, just popping. He had a 41% target share, 46% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.94, weighted target per route run of 1.31. This is supposed to be a 0-1 scale, so just a huge day from Jarvis Landry in terms of the underlying volume, and a huge day in terms of the actual production. A yards per route run of 6.81 with a yards per target of 13. He went 8 for 143 and 1 on 11 targets. Just an awesome day for Jarvis Landry, kind of establishing himself this week as the wide receiver 1 with Odell Beckham out. And I would have been talking about Kadarius Hodge after he had a strong week. He was way down at 38% routes run per drop back, targeted at a decent rate, 25% target per route run. So that was pretty good for Kadarius Hodge. But because he was out there so little, had just an 11% target share, 12% air yard share, a whopper of 0.25. Weighted targets per route run pretty damn strong at 0.61. So Hodge still looking like he's somewhat interesting as a player. Yards per target of 10.3, yards per route run of 2.58. These are good numbers, but only 3 targets. Rashard Higgins was the guy playing in front of him. He ran around on 66% of dropbacks. He had 7% of the targets, 9% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.17, which is pretty bad. Weighted targets per out run of 0.24, which is very bad. He only had 2 targets running out there, twice as many routes basically as Hodge. So I wonder if that kind of flips back towards Hodge. We'll have to see. Taywan Taylor was also out there in this game. Not really someone to be that interested in, but worth noting that he is running ahead of Donovan Peoples-Jones, who even in Dynasty is looking a bit iffy. He's had a real chance open up for him with Odell Beckham's injury, has not been able to take advantage of it. Ran a route here on 6% of dropbacks, was not targeted. So I think even in Dynasty, he's looking at an iffy hold. At tight end, this has become kind of a gross situation. Austin Hooper running a route here on 53% of dropbacks. Harrison Bryant at 50%, David Njoku at 44%. None of these guys was targeted at a very high rate. I think partially because Jarvis Landry was soaking up all the targets. I'm not too worried about the targets per route run because the tight end does seem to be fairly featured in the offense here, but I am concerned about the routes being split up 3 ways, 53%, 50%, and 44%. It's going to make all of these guys tough to trust. Austin Hooper did get in the end zone, saved his day, but only had 2 for 13. Harrison Bryant went 1 for 13 on 2 targets. So keep an eye on this tight end split because it's going to be really tough to trust any of these guys, and I'm just not doing it until I get a better sense of Hooper out in front again with some kind of, you'd at least want to see a guy up in the 60% plus range for routes run per drop back before I really have any interest in starting them. Moving to Denver, what can we say about this game? We could pretty much breeze through this game. I'm not going to spend too much time on a team that didn't have a quarterback. Actually, I'm not even going to spend any time at all because my charts got mixed up this week. So I'm going to talk about Dallas first. So moving to Ezekiel Elliott, he played 66% of the snaps, had a really weak workload for what we're used to from Zeke with 9.8 expected points, left 4.9 points on the field. Just a really bad day. Had 1 green zone carry, but did not convert on it. Ran around on 55% of dropbacks, was kind of involved there. Got 3 targets, but only went 1 for 7 through the air. So just all in all, really gross stuff from Zeke. Tony Pollard, he played 36% of the snaps, and I think really proving he's in this kind of 2-to-1 split. It's not quite 60-40, but it's like 66-33 type of deal, maybe 70-30. But bottom line, Zeke is not the workhorse that we were expecting him to be entering the season and that he showed to be early in the season. Pollard, I think, has earned that kind of around 30, low 30s% of the snaps here. Only had 4.7 expected points. And, this is going to be a tough backfield to want to play guys in, but certainly for Dynasty, keep this in mind. If Pollard has established himself as, a 30% snaps type of guy, certainly possible he could force a true 50-50 split by next season. So Pollard, obviously someone that's been a bit frustrating. If you took him in redraft, he's been someone that I've had in Dynasty now for 2 seasons with not really that much to show for it, but I do think he could be pretty interesting down the line. Kind of interesting to see his role continue to grow into something that's now stabilized into that 30% range. At wide receiver, Amari Cooper ran a route on 80% of dropbacks. He had 24% of the targets, 54% of the air yards, and a whopper of 0.74, which is a wide receiver 1 level whopper. Pretty nice there. And a weighted targets per route run of 0.71, which is a wide receiver 1 level 2. Had a really nice yards per target of 14. His yards per route run was 3.5, which is super, super elite. He went 6 for 112 and a touchdown on 8 targets. So it's all awesome, except Amari Cooper ran around on 80% of dropbacks. What's up with that? He should be up at 95 to 100%. Where this is going to be a theme for Dallas this week because Michael Gallup ran a route on 73% of dropbacks. He had 24% of the targets. He had 23% of the air yards. He had a whopper of 0.52. Pretty strong weighted target per route run of 0.6. he was not as efficient on his targets with a 5.1 yards per target and therefore only a yards per out run of 1.41. But why was he only out there for 73% of dropbacks? I'd be okay with it if it meant that we got a lot more CeeDee Lamb. We didn't. He was also at 73% routes run per dropback. He still had 21% of the targets, 14% of the air yards, a whopper 0.42, which is not bad. A weighted target per route run of 0.49, pretty solid. I would say even good. Yards per target of 3, which is terrible, with the yards per route run, therefore, of 0.72. But here's the thing. All of these guys were basically the entire passing offense, but none of them had better than 80% route run per dropback. Why? Noah Brown was out there for 30% of dropbacks, and Cedric Wilson ran a route on 30% of dropbacks as well. Neither was targeted. Just frustrating because it does feel like these guys would be crushing if they could get more routes. I think they're being held back, certainly by not having Dak Prescott, absolutely. But it's also like if you're not going to have Dak Prescott, at least get these guys out there all the time. Here on the chart, you can see that they're all below the level that we're looking for. All of them. Literally every single player on this team is below the routes run that we want to see. So that was frustrating in this game. Dalton Schultz ran a route on 80% of dropbacks. He had a targets per route run of 16%, which is not very good. An 8 out of 2.2, which is really low, obviously. And so therefore a weighted target per route run of 0.29, which is not great. Yards per target of 0.48, which is not good. Yards per route run of 0.75, which is not good. So all of this is not good for Dalton Schultz, but ran around on 80% of dropbacks. That alone is pretty interesting at tight end this year. So wouldn't be giving up on Dalton Schultz. This was not a good game from him. But when you get a tight end who's out there for 80% plus of dropbacks, who's out there more than Michael Gallup or CeeDee Lamb, then, I think you have to just kind of keep rolling with them. Probably don't have a much better option. In Denver, we finally get to this disgusting Denver game. Again, not going to take too much from this game. I think we can breeze through it pretty quickly. Melvin Gordon out there for 81% of snaps. That's pretty nice. Nice to see him out there if you're a Melvin Gordon owner for 81% plus. The other two running backs out there a fair amount too because of this weird quarterbackless game. Phillip Lindsay out there for 33%. Royce Freeman out there for 30%. But, what are you going to say? At wide receiver, we have, at wide receiver, we had Jerry Jeudy running around on 91% of dropbacks. Tim Patrick was out there for 100%. KJ Hamler was out there for 64%. I don't care about the targets this week because, these guys they're going to be targeted by a quarterback next time. But I will say that, KJ Hamler being out there for 64% compared to 100% for Tim Patrick, I don't think there's really a question about who the wide receiver 2 is at this point. It has really become sorry. It has really become clear that it's Tim Patrick and not KJ Hamler. Noah Fant was out there for 64% of dropbacks, and that's not exactly what we'd want to see. I could see him being not out there as much because of the injury. I was thinking this injury that he's played through, this ankle injury, was not going to be such an issue, but it seems like maybe it's still bothering him, or this could also just be one of these things from the Denver game. Moving to Detroit, we did not have DeAndre Swift in this game, so we got the Kerrane Johnson show in terms of snaps with 48% of snaps for Kerrane Johnson. He was also very heavily involved as a receiver with 4 targets for 4 receptions and 52 yards. Adrian Peterson got both touchdowns in this game with 4 green zone carries. So even though he was only out there for 27% of the snaps, he had 15.7 expected points to 11.5 for Kerrane Johnson. Adrian Peterson added 1.8 expected points to his workload by getting in the end zone, and Kerrane Johnson added 2.3 expected point or points to his expected points workload by being efficient as a receiver. Jonathan Williams was also involved in this game with 26% of the snaps. He was kind of a passing down back, kind of oddly involved, ran around on 71% of snaps. So hopefully that's not a thing, although Kerrane Johnson lost a fumble in this game, so I wonder if that had something to do with it, and also Jonathan Williams lost a fumble, so hopefully he won't be really anything to worry about once DeAndre Swift is back. But this could have been a pretty big game for DeAndre Swift because, we got the 4 green zone carries for Adrian Peterson, the 2 touchdowns, 15.7 expected points there, 11.5 for Kerrane. Very easy to see how DeAndre Swift gets above 20 expected points in this game. We know he's a much better player than these other two, so really disappointing that we didn't get DeAndre Swift in what could have been one of his better games of the season if he had played. At wide receiver, we have Marvin Jones in a clear wide receiver 1 role, running a route on 98% of dropbacks. So the target per route run, 26%, which is really strong for his 8 out of 14. That deep threat not typically coming with that high a rate of targets. 29% target share, 48% air yard share, a wide receiver 1, borderline elite whopper of 0.77. Really, really strong stuff from Marvin Jones in terms of his ability to get targets and his volume. Not strong stuff from a yards per target perspective with just 4. Yards per route run as a result of 1.02. Went 6 for 48 on 12 targets. So pretty disappointing stuff from Marvin Jones. But, it's Marvin Jones. We know he's basically dust. We know that he's trying to play the Kenny Golladay role, which he really can't play at this point in his career. And also, what are they supposed to do? What are the Lions supposed to do with Kenny Golladay out? Because their other options to play that role are Marvin Hall, who ran a route on 67% of dropbacks, just had a 13% target per route run, target share of 10%, air yard share of 11%, whopper of 0.22. So not really a viable target at all, especially because he also added a yards per target of 4. So not really a better option here than Marvin Jones by any means, with a yards per route run of 0.5. So actually just half of the poor yards per route run that Marvin Jones delivered. Hall having 2 receptions for 16 yards on 4 targets. The other guy that was kind of in that type of role was Quintus Cephas. He ran around 35% of dropbacks, had an ADOT of 11.5, second deepest to Marvin Jones. Target share 5%, air yard share of 7%, whopper of 0.12, which is pretty gross. He actually was okay on his targets with 13.5 yards per target, but didn't earn targets at a high rate. So his yards per outrun was also poor at 1.59. None of these guys really doing much on the outside. Mohamed Sanu was pretty involved and didn't play all that badly. He was playing out of the slot as the replacement for Danny Amendola. We're thinking it might be Jamal Agnew getting the majority of the work. It was actually Mohamed Sanu, who ran a route on 50% of dropbacks. He had a 10% target share, 8% air yard share, and a 0.2 whopper, but a weighted target per route run of 0.38, which was stronger than both Hall and Cephas and much stronger than Jamal Agnew. So he was kind of the wide receiver 2 this week, even though he wasn't out there for more than 50%. And he got in the end zone. Jamal Agnew ran around on 31% of dropbacks, so he was still somewhat involved, but only target per route run of 7%, weighted target per route run of 0.12. So didn't do a good job of getting involved when out there. This all helped, I think, TJ Hawkinson, who was functionally the wide receiver 2 this week. He ran around on 73%. So that's nice, because I was talking about how he hadn't been up above 70% for a while. This was the first time since week 8 that he ran a route on 70+% of dropbacks. So that was pretty solid. Still would like to have seen him up in the 80s, but 73%, I'll take it. Target per route run of 20%, which is also pretty solid. 8 out of 6.8, which is kind of right where we typically see tight ends. Yards per target of 12.7, which is good. And so a yards per route run of 2.54, which is pretty damn good. So didn't get in the end zone here, but went 5 for 89 on 8 targets. So really nice day from TJ Hawkinson. Nice to see him have a big game here with Kenny Golladay out and Marvin Jones soaking up a lot of targets, still allowed Hockenson to have a pretty nice day because he was basically the wide receiver too. Moving to Green Bay, we have this kind of split here again with Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams. Aaron Jones with 54% of the snaps and 11.3 expected points workload. Inefficient on the day because he did not convert his one green zone carry, leaving 1.3 points on the field. Jamal Williams had 46% of the snaps, 8.6 expected points. He was efficient with 4.7 points over expected. He went 17 for 73 and a touchdown. So scored even though it was outside of the green zone. Whereas Aaron Jones went 17 for 90, did not score in his green zone attempt. So again, we're kind of seeing this much closer to 50-50 than we would have expected. I do wonder if some of this is just related to the game script. Aaron Jones ran a route on 39% of his snaps to Williams' 27%. It's not that Aaron Jones is game script dependent, but this is not an ideal script for Aaron Jones as kind of the guy who's more involved in the receiving game typically. Jamal Williams probably stands to benefit a bit more when they have a clear lead. They're just trying to kind of grind it out. You would expect, I think, Jamal Williams to be a little bit more involved in that type of script, and they did have the same amount of carries here. So still bullish on Aaron Jones going forward. It's been a little bit frustrating to see him so close to Jamal Williams over the last few weeks, but I'm not panicking over it. At Green Bay, I haven't changed this chart yet. Sorry. At Green Bay wide receiver, Davante Adams ran a route on 97% of dropbacks. He had a target share of 31%, an air yard share of 48%, an elite wide receiver one, obvious wide receiver one, whopper of 0.8, an awesome weighted targets per route run of 0.82, really strong underlying volume from Davante Adams. Did not pair it with elite yards per target, only had a 6.8 yards per target, but he still had a yards per route run of over 2, which is impressive, 2.03. He just gets so many targets per route that he doesn't necessarily even need to be that efficient on those targets to put up an elite yards per route run. 30%, 31% target share here, 30% target per route run here. So those are elite numbers. Davante Adams continues to be really having a historic season. It's been very impressive, and he did get in the end zone here, went 6 for 61 on 9 targets. You know, on the show with Ben, I was talking about how we can basically just always count on Marcus Valdes-Scantling. I even compared him to the sun. I don't know what was going on. It was Thanksgiving week, but the sun exploded because Marcus Valdes-Scantling did not get targeted on 27 routes. Really rough day for him. He did run a route on 87% of dropbacks, so he's out there all the time. I guarantee he was doing the same Marcus Valdes-Scantling thing of running deep, but he just didn't get targeted. Allen Lazard, he did get targeted 6 times, so definitely did seem to make a dent in my theory that it doesn't really matter if he's out there because Valdes-Scantling is just going to be running deep no matter what Lazard does. But, you know, I guess there's only so many dropbacks to go around, and Allen Lazard got 6 targets here. Ran around 65% of dropbacks, had 21% of the targets, 23% of the air yards, and a whopper of 0.47. Pretty solid day for Lazard, and a weighted target per route run here that's really nice of 0.73. So if he ends up getting more playing time, you know, we could see some better things from Allen Lazard. And it just seemed to be kind of the intermediate guy's day here with Robert Tonyan also having a nice day at tight end, running around on 74% of dropbacks, 22% targets per route run, 8 out of 8.2. So, you know, running that decent intermediate area. And he had a yards per target of 13.4 with an elite yards per route run of 2.91. So strong day from Tonyan, strong day from Lazard, strong day from Davante Adams. Is basically all the guys except the deep threat guys. Although Equanimous St. Brown, he kind of usually plays a little bit more similar to Marcus Valdes-Scantling, kind of in somewhat of that deep threat role. But that wasn't really the case this week. Just had an 8 out of 8 in this game. Target share of 7%. air yard share of 7%, but he was very efficient on his targets, went 2 for 39 on 2 targets with a yards per target of 19.5. So, but bottom line, it was really kind of a strong day for all the intermediate options, and Marcus Valdes-Scantling disappeared. Moving to Houston, we had the snaps that we wanted to see from Duke Johnson in this game. 75% of the snaps, which is, that's strong. That's a borderline elite snap count for, or snap share for a running back, but it didn't come with the expected points workload that we want to see. He only had 9.9 expected points, did add 7.1 expected points to that. He had 3 receptions for 43 yards and a touchdown on 4 targets, which is where that's coming from. So pretty nice day as a receiver for Johnson, but that's going to be hard to rely on, especially in this offense where they don't tend to throw to the running backs very often. The thing that's concerning, if you are considering, playing Duke Johnson in any leagues where, I have him in a couple leagues where I kind of would like to be able to rely on Duke Johnson, but when CJ Prosise gets 2 green zone carries and a green zone target, scores on the target, didn't score on the carries, and Duke Johnson gets no green zone work at all, that's definitely concerning. The snaps wouldn't have reflected that. CJ Prosise only played 18% of the snaps to 75% for Johnson. So maybe this is just kind of a weird, fluky thing. But man, that's a fair amount of green zone work to have, for Johnson to have lost. And Johnson is not necessarily the profile of running back that is like going to be locked into green zone work, you would think. So it's not necessarily the Nick Chubb thing where you can go, yeah, Hunt had the green zone work, but it's Nick Chubb. They're not afraid to use him at the goal line. Let's kind of bet against that. I'm a little bit more nervous doing that with Duke Johnson, given that he's a bit of a smaller back. He's not a super small back, but he's been treated over the course of his career as if he's like a passing down specialist. So this was definitely worrying for Duke Johnson. At wide receiver, pour one out for Will Fuller, right? I mean, just brutal. Going to be out the rest of the season and even the first game of next season after being suspended for PEDs, and he went out with a bang here, 6 for 171 and 2 touchdowns on 7 targets. An amazing game from Will Fuller, and the underlying numbers backed it up. Ran around on 93% of dropbacks, had 30% target share, 35% air yard share, a whopper of 0.7, weighted target per route run of 0.75, yards per target of 24.4, which is absurd. Yards per route run of 6.11. I'm happy to see guys get above 2. He closed out his season with the yards per route run of 6.11. So, hopefully Will Fuller lands on his feet next season. I don't think he'll end up back with the Texans. This is a team that, is kind of trying to do like this weird rebuild thing, and they're going to have a new head coach. I don't know. Maybe they'll bring him back. He certainly meshes very well with Deshaun Watson. But who knows? Maybe he's going to be looking for a bunch of money and doesn't end up back there. So, but, for this season, it's just crushing. We have him on one of our high stakes teams with Sean Siegel and Ben Gretch. And we just put up this massive point total this week. And now we don't have Will Fuller. So we're all pretty bummed about that. Brandon Cooks owners are going to be doing backflips here, though, because he now stands to inherit a lot more target volume. He has been running a ton of routes all season and ran a route again here on 100% of dropbacks. Has the 11.8 ADOT, so kind of operating right in that primary range or where the primary wide receiver tends to operate. 22% target share, 18% air yard share, whopper of 0.46. He was also very efficient on the day with the yards per target of 17. The yards per route run of 2.83. So he could be looking at some really, really nice volume going forward. Kiki QT, he ran a route on 63% of dropbacks. That obviously could increase as well. Had an ADOT of 16.7, target share of 13%, air yard share of 16%, and a whopper of 0.31. Weighted target per route run of 0.48, which is better. Wasn't really that good on his targets, 5.7 yards per target, but definitely going to be interesting going forward. What will be most interesting, I think, is how they play the wide receiver 3 role. Kenny Stills is on waivers, but you also have Isaiah Coulter, who I think would be the guy they would just kind of roll with him. He was one of their, I believe, 4th or 5th round pick this year, a small school prospect, but a true underclassman, someone I've had my eye on, I've stashed in deeper dynasties. I do recommend picking him up if he's available anywhere. In redraft and stuff, it's a little bit thinner, but if you need wide receivers, probably worse start throws just because you get a guy paired with Deshaun Watson, and it's possible that QT kind of plays more of the slot role still, and that we get a fair amount of routes from Coulter, and he could be kind of a Gabriel Davis type of play there. He probably is going to end up being more like a John Hightower than a Gabriel Davis, but if he's free, if you can get him cheaply, not the worst thing. Jordan Akins ran a route here on 57% of dropbacks. He had a target per route run of 12%, not very good. Was targeted pretty deep downfield, strangely enough, 15.5 ADOT. Only had 2 targets, though. Did not catch either. So the tight ends continue to be pretty tough to trust here. Although I will say, route run on 57%, getting close to the point where you could consider Jordan Akins a fairly decent dart throw. Darren Fells down at 13%. Pharaoh Brown down at 27%. Neither of these guys was targeted. If you could get, both of them down, let's say Pharaoh Brown got down into like the 15% range, then at that point, I think Jordan Akins would be a lot easier to stomach. Moving to Indianapolis, we did not have Jonathan Taylor for this game, and Nyheim Hines benefited with 65% of the snaps and an elite workload of 21.3 expected points. He did leave 3.8 points on the field. He did not convert on 2 green zone carries. But, 21.3 expected points is pretty nice. And that a lot of that came through the air with 10 targets, 8 receptions, 66 receiving yards. That is nice to see, because if he was not getting so heavily involved as a receiver, it could have been an extremely frustrating day for Nyheim Hines owners, because Jacoby Brissett was playing the goal line back here. That left Jordan Wilkins owners in a bind, because he did not get any green zone work, where you would have expected him to do that. He probably would do that if Phillip Rivers had been on the field instead of Brissett, but Wilkins played 35% of the snaps. He did get 9.2 expected points still without any green zone work. He had 4 targets, which a lot more than I would have thought. He went 3 for 35. He had 6 attempts for 22 yards. So kind of saved his day through the air as well. At wide receiver, Michael Pittman made another case for himself as the wide receiver 1 here, running a route on 85% of dropbacks, had a target share of 21%, air yard share 27%, a whopper of 0.51. Was not efficient, though. He had yards per target of 3.5, yards per route run of 0.7. So getting the targets that we want to see for the most part, running a good amount of routes, but I don't know if it's going to. It seems like they're kind of forcing it with him a little bit. Like he's not really like breaking out so much as they're trying to see if he can be their wide receiver 1 when they don't really have one. Hasn't quite developed that rapport with Rivers yet, but it is important that he's getting this chance. I think he could ultimately pop down the stretch. T.Y. Hilton was kind of the wide receiver 2 here. He ran around on 74% of dropbacks. He had 12% of the targets, 20% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.32, pretty meh. He had a yards per target, though, of 16.2, so quite good on the volume that he did get. He went 4 for 81 and a touchdown on 5 targets. Zach Pascal ran around on 70% of dropbacks. He was a deep threat in this game. He's been kind of all over the place in terms of his ADOT this year. Not really sure what to make of that. He's been used very, very shallowly at times, very deep at times, but a whopper ultimately of 0.31 in this game. Weighted target per route run, which is a little better, of 0.45. Not efficient, though. Yards per route run of 0.7. Not really targeted at a high rate. Very inefficient on his targets with the yards per target of 0.6. So overall, I think Pittman is the only real play here. Certainly if you gambled on Hilton this week, it paid off. He did get in the end zone. He did have that awesome yards per target, but that's not something I'm willing to go back to the well on. I think Pittman is really the only guy where you can, consider playing, just betting on the volume. Trey Burton at tight end had a lot of volume in this game with the targets per route run of 24%. He had a whopper, which is pretty solid for a tight end, at 0.37. Weighted target per route run of 0.7, which is like an elite number for a tight end. A pretty strong, it's like a wide receiver 1 level weighted target per route run, and he's a tight end. yards per route run of 2. That's pretty good. He wasn't out there enough, though. He only ran around on 45% of dropbacks. And when he was out there, it seemed like Rivers was just going to him nonstop. I don't understand why you wouldn't just leave him out there. You don't have any wide receivers. But, they're taking him off the field. They're putting Jack Doyle on the field, which makes no sense to me. Jack Doyle ran around on 23% of dropbacks, which way too much. That should be like 2.3% of dropbacks, frankly. And he was only targeted on 9% of his routes. He did not catch his one target. Jack Doyle's done. Stop playing him. Mo Alley-Cox, I think, is a much more interesting player. He did not have a good game in this one. He ran around on 49% of dropbacks, target per route run of just 9%. He had a whopper of just 0.1, so pretty weak day for Mo Alley-Cox. But we've seen some interesting stuff out of him this season. I definitely don't mind the fact they're playing Mo Alley-Cox. I would like to see one of these guys get more run at the expense of the other, just so we could start playing them and trusting them, because it does seem like Rivers wants to go to the tight end. But unfortunately, we're kind of seeing this split. At the very least, please stop playing Jack Doyle. Moving to Jacksonville, bit of a better game than I would have thought for these weapons here under Mike Glennon, partly for James Robinson because he got a dominant snap share of 97%, just an absurd snap count and snap share. I mean, he played 63 snaps in this game. I mean, he had a huge snap share, huge raw snap total. He had a expected point workload of 22.5, which is an elite workload for a running back. It is not an elite workload for an entire backfield. He had all of the expected points in this backfield. So from the perspective of how valuable is this backfield, not all that valuable, but one guy's getting all of it. And that is very valuable. He had 5 green zone carries in this game, only converted one of them, but still played efficiently. He went 128 and 1 on 22 rushing attempts. He went 5 for 31 on 6 targets. So he did add 4.4 points in efficiency to his 22.5 expected points workload. Dare Ogunbowale was inactive in this game due to a hand injury. I think that is, I wouldn't say a big part of the reason, but it certainly factored into why he had such a dominant share of the workload here. I think that if Ogunbowale was active, we probably would be looking at something like 15 to 25% of the snaps for Ogunbowale, who plays kind of that third down hurry up type of role. And Ezigbo just didn't play. Ezigbo was the backup, only played 3% of the snaps in this game, is not involved in that role. He looks like a direct handcuff to Robinson and someone who's really not even involved, even getting mixed in. So Chris Thompson on IR here. If Ogunbowale misses again, I think you can continue to dial up James Robinson. It doesn't even really matter if he gets Glennon or Luton or Minshew. It doesn't really matter if he's going to get close to 100% of the snaps. Pretty wild. Don't really see that at the running back position very often. At wide receiver, Keelan Cole ran a route on 100% of dropbacks. He had a target share of 18%, air yard share of 31%, a whopper of 0.49. Operated as the wide receiver 1 basically in this game with Conley out and with DJ Shark out. It was basically Cole who was the wide receiver 1. Laviska Shenault had a missed opportunity here. Would have liked to see him operate as the wide receiver 1, and he did run a route on 94% of dropbacks. And he was also pretty solid in terms of yards per target, 10.3 yards per target. Not bad. However, did not earn targets at a high rate. Only a 9% target per route run, leading to a whopper of 0.22. A weighted target per route run, pretty bad, of 0.19. So, 3 for 31 on 4 targets, it's pretty good, but just getting the 4 targets on 94% target per route run, or 94% routes run per dropback, not great. Maybe you could chalk this up to Glennon, but could also potentially chalk it up to Colin Johnson, who had a pretty strong game in this game here. He's a 5th round pick, guy who had an injury-riddled college career. I do have him stashed in a couple kind of deep dynasties, and I do think is a worthy add in Dynasty. He had a route run on 89% of dropbacks, target per route run of 25%. He had a Whopper of 0.63. So he led the wide receivers. He led the team in Whopper. And because he didn't run a full slate of routes, it looks even better when you look at weighted targets per route run, where he was at 0.77, borderline elite number there. Also efficient on his targets at 12 yards per target. So we could see more from Colin Johnson. They may want to give him more run. He had a yards per route run of 3. The team might be interested in what they have here. He had 4 for 96 and a touchdown on 8 targets. So, not seeing more out of Colin Johnson at all. Would certainly, if I was, in charge of the Jaguars, and the position is open now, but I would play him over Chris Conley, I think, right? You got to see what you have in this guy, kind of a similar role to Conley. Johnson had an 8 out of 16.9, so he is kind of that deep threat guy. Would be kind of interesting to pair him and DJ Shark with the underneath guys in Chenault and Cole. Cole sometimes runs pretty deep downfield. This week, for example, he had an 8 out of 18.5. But I think with Shark back, it'd be kind of cool to see Shark and Johnson operating as the 2 deep threats, with Chenault underneath alongside Cole, mixing in with Cole probably. At tight end, Tyler Eifert ran a route on 67% of dropbacks. He did score, but target per route run of just 17%. Not terrible, but not great. Yards per target of 4. So he saved his day with a touchdown, but I wouldn't chase that. Moving to the Chiefs, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, he had 59% of the snaps here. Pretty decent lead on Le'Veon Bell, who was at 30%, but the expected points workload was very weak for both these guys. 6.1 for Edwards-Helaire and 5.3 for Bell. Both guys were slightly inefficient on the day, but the big story is that the workload wasn't there. I wouldn't get too, CEH is becoming kind of a flex play at this point just because the floor is so low, but he did have 59% of the snaps. So he is the guy to continue to trust, I think, continue to roll out and just, swing for the fences with a guy who is getting close to 60% of the snaps on the Chiefs. Le'Veon Bell is a much, much more risky play, just because, only 30% of the snaps. And you do see games like this where the workload just is not there for the running backs at all. At wide receiver, it was the Tyreek Hill show. Did anyone miss the Tyreek Hill show? This thing was insane. He had 33% of the targets, 47% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.81. He ran around 89% of dropbacks, so he did not run a full slate of routes, and he still had these type of numbers. It's wild. Weighted target per route run of 0.88, yards per target of 19.2. He had a yards per route run of 5.6, which is obviously absurd. He had 226 air yards. He went 13 for 269 and 3 touchdowns on 15 targets. Just an absurd day out of Tyreek Hill. Truly went off. Sammy Watkins in this game was right back to being the wide receiver too. You probably didn't notice because it all went to Tyreek Hill, but Sammy Watkins did run around 76% of dropbacks. Very clearly kind of back in his old role, I think. Only a whopper 0.3 this week, but definitely not someone to forget about. Sammy Watkins has returned. Demarcus Robinson also ran around 76% of dropbacks. Also had a pretty weak whopper of 0.26, but way ahead of Mecole Hardman, who was running around on only 30% of dropbacks. So it's the top 3 wide receivers. Hardman, despite having guys go out with injury, never really made a case for himself as a full-time player, and looks like he's kind of back to the fantasy bench here. Travis Kelce, he went 8 for 82 in this year at tight end. That's pretty awesome. And this was like a down week, right? This was a down week because Tyreek Hill soaked up so much of the volume. But Travis Kelce, even though he didn't get in the end zone, still had pretty solid games. So continues just to be an absolute stud. Moving to the Las Vegas Raiders. We have an injury here, so this will kind of shake things up going forward. Let's see. Where do these guys go in my notes? So we have an injury here. In this game, Josh Jacobs played 60% of the snaps. He had just 7.3 expected points. Obviously not ideal. And Devontae Booker actually had the bigger expected points workload with 10. Now, Booker left 8.5 points on the field. He was targeted in the green zone but did not score. He had 4 targets and 1 reception for -1 yard. So that's why he left basically, close to all of his opportunity out on the field. But, did have the bigger workload on just 35% of the snaps. And now we've got a situation where Josh Jacobs, who left with an ankle injury and has a quote-unquote chance to play in Week 13, that doesn't sound very bullish. Jalen Richard may be out again as well. And if so, Devontae Booker is really set up here. Despite this inefficiency this week, we've seen him make some really impressive plays over the last few weeks. So I'm not too concerned about that. I think the guy can play. He's looked good this season. And he steps into what could be the consolidation of Josh Jacobs' role, Jalen Richard's old role, and his current role could be kind of similar to what we saw down the stretch from DeAndre Washington. So pretty exciting if Devontae Booker gets a chance. And he's someone that we've talked about, me and Pete, on Ship Chasing a bunch as kind of one of the elite handcuffs. Ben and I talked about him on Chasing Signals last week. So, in the high stakes league, he's been pretty much gone for a couple weeks, but I hope you were able to get him on some of your shallower leagues for the playoff push. At wide receiver, let's see. Nelson Aguilar ran around on 67% of dropbacks. He had 16% of the targets, 22% of the air yards, and a whopper of 0.39. Just when you think you can trust Nelson fucking Aguilar, kind of lets you down. He was still pretty involved. Didn't run a full slate of routes, though. Only ran around 67% of dropbacks, went 554. So it wasn't a total disaster, but had been looking like he was potentially the clear wide receiver 1 here. The thing was, there wasn't really a clear wide receiver 1 here at all. Henry Ruggs had, potentially kind of the wide receiver 1 day. Not really. He ran around on 64% of dropbacks, had the deep threat ADOT that we're used to, 19.6, target share 14%. The only way that you could kind of stretch and say he was sort of the wide receiver 1 was the 39% air yards, which did lead the team, but and a whopper of 0.48, which also led the team, but wasn't really targeted all that heavily. With 5 targets, went 3 for 56 on that. So kind of that medium level volume deep threat role, kind of bounced back towards Henry Ruggs away from Nelson Aguilar. As I talked about on last week's Stat Chasing, that we might see that. We kind of did see that. Hunter Renfrow was also more involved this week. He had a 29% target per route run, very heavily involved on his targets, and also led the wide receivers in routes run per dropback with 69%. Had a 24% target share, 15% air yard share, whopper of 0.47, just behind Ruggs there. Yards per target of 8.1, so a pretty nice yards per route run of 2.35. Went 7 for 73 on 9 targets. When Hunter Renfrow plays, he usually plays pretty well. His yards per route run is usually pretty damn high. He continues to be up above 2 this season. He was above 2 as a rookie. He's a good player, but he's a very specific type of player. And so, never going to be this dominant fantasy producer, but I've been saying this for weeks now. He's going to be in the league for a while. I think he's shown pretty impressively so far in his career. Darren Waller, tight end, he was basically the wide receiver 1 this week. Was the only guy out there for more than 70% of dropbacks. Ran around on 80% of dropbacks. Target per route run of 19%, which is a bit lower than we're used to seeing. 8 out of 6.9, kind of operating in that intermediate area where we're used to. 0.42 whopper with 19% of the targets and 19% of the air yards. So pretty strong in terms of the underlying volume there. Because he's out there so much, he can get targeted at a lower rate than ideal for a tight end. The thing that really hurt his day was that he only had 3.3 yards per target, which is obviously pretty bad. He went 4 for 23 on 7 targets. So, that's obviously going to hurt. But I think with Darren Waller, kind of need to keep the faith a little bit here. He plays the Jets this week. He is second among tight ends in expected points this year. He is first among tight ends in Whopper. He has a yards per target this year of 6.2, which is bad, but he is not a bad player. I'm kind of betting that, this could be the spot against the Jets. You got a team that can't really push the Raiders. I guess the problem would be that the Raiders are just going to want to run the ball down the Jets' throat, but the Jets want teams to pass on them for some reason. And, if the Raiders just oblige the Jets, then Darren Waller could really pop off this week. So he is someone that's already jumping out to me as a strong play, strong raw play. I haven't looked at the salaries and stuff yet, but yeah, Darren Waller setting up, and, he's been so inefficient on the yards per target. He's missed so many opportunities. It's so easy not to pay up for tight ends this year that I do wonder if he'll be a little bit contrarian, and kind of excited about slotting him into some lineups this week. Moving to, let's see, where are we? Moving to the Chargers. Austin Eckler. Austin Eckler was back this week. He had 72% of the snaps. He had 32 expected points. That is an elite workload. He left 8.2 points on the field, so it could have been a massive day for Austin Eckler. Easily, he just placed expectations, and he's got a 30-plus point day. He had 2 green zone carries. He did not score. I think one of them, it looked like he did score on a green zone target, which he also had 2 of, but they didn't challenge, and then Josh Kelly jumped in to the end zone the very next play, so that was a bit of a bummer. I had Austin Eckler in the Crack Rock main event league. We've got him, so would have liked to see the touchdown there. And also had him in DFS quite a bit. So would have liked to see that. But, what are you going to do? Josh Kelly scored a touchdown on 3 green zone carries, dove into the end zone, as I mentioned. He only played 23% of the snaps. So Austin Eckler clearly back with 72% of the snaps, clear lead running back usage. Troy Maine Pope down at 7%, not really involved at all. Be interesting to see once Balaj is back, but I think Eckler is almost a lock to get at least 60%. I would say probably, that 65+% range going forward. And there's upside for more here since he wasn't fully healthy potentially. I think he is basically fully healthy, but they may have been easing him in a little bit. I would say it's certainly possible we see him up above 70% again going forward, and maybe even approaching 80% of the snaps, because Austin Eckler can play, and I think, he got 16 targets from Herbert. Herbert looking for him nonstop. So I'm pretty excited about Eckler going forward. He is looking like a potential smash down the stretch. For anyone who was able to hold him through the injury and still make the playoffs, you're set up really, really well. At wide receiver, Keenan Allen had a bit of a down week. You see him here on the chart, kind of in the Larry Fitzgerald zone where you run a ton of routes and don't get targeted at a high rate, which is not what we're used to seeing from Keenan Allen, who usually gets a ton of targets, only targeted on 17% of his routes this week. Had a routes run per dropback of 95%, so still out there all the time. Target share of 20%, air yard share of 27%, a whopper of 0.48. He had a yards per target of 4.4, so paired with the lower than usual targets, that yards per target really hurt. Yards per route run of 0.77. So overall, pretty bad day for Keenan Allen, kind of a floor game, but he did get in the end zone. So 4 for 40, saved his day with a touchdown. Mike Williams, kind of a strange day for Mike Williams and Jalen Guyton, who both had lower than expected ADOTs. Mike Williams at 10.6, Jalen Guyton at 8.5. 10.6 was the highest on the team. I think this kind of speaks to the fact that Justin Herbert was having a bit of a rough game and couldn't get deep shots to these guys the way we're typically used to seeing Mike Williams, Guyton operating deep downfield. That opens up the field for Keenan Allen. So it kind of makes sense that Keenan Allen having this down game also happened in the game where the deep threats weren't really operating deep. Mike Williams did run around on 82% of dropbacks, as did Jalen Guyton. They both had kind of mediocre to poor whoppers. Williams was at 0.31, Guyton at 0.32. Hunter Henry was a bit of a bright spot here. He ran a route on 82% of dropbacks, had a nice target per route run of 22%, and an ADOT of 8.5. Target share here of 20%, air yard share of 38%, actually led all the receivers in air yards, and a whopper of 0.56. So really nice game here from Hunter Henry in the underlying volume. Did only have a yards per target of 6.7 though, yards per route run of 1.49. So not a great day from Hunter Henry overall in terms of the per target efficiency, but 7 for 67, certainly not bad. That's coming on 10 targets. So really nice to see the 10 targets for Hunter Henry. Moving to the Rams, we've got this three-way split that's just so gross. Man, we got this week we had Darrell Henderson at 32% of the snaps. I kind of mentioned him first because he's sort of the nominal starter, but at this point he's splitting time with Cam Akers. Cam Akers had 27% of the snaps, and they're basically splitting the role of one running back. Malcolm Brown is kind of playing this third down, hurry up running back role. He had 40% of the snaps. And they all kind of have these expected points workload that aren't that great. Darrell Henderson was at 6.3, Cam Akers was at 7.6, and Malcolm Brown was at 4.7. So, no one even at 8 or above. And this is with Cam Akers getting 2 green zone carries. He did score 1 green zone carry, but overall Cam Akers only had 9 rushing attempts. So it's going to be tough to rack up that huge workload when you only get 9 rushing attempts. Darrell Henderson had 10. Cam Akers played really well, added 6.2 points in efficiency, went 84-1 on his 9 attempts. So pretty nice to see that. But, Malcolm Brown is kind of the real thorn in the side of these two guys. And I don't think he's necessarily going away. And, he is stealing a bunch of that passing down work, which is obviously really important. I will say for dynasty purposes, Malcolm Brown is a free agent after the year. And both these guys are somewhat involved in the receiving game. So, if Brown departs and they can split up his role, then both guys become pretty interesting. I think both look like buys going forward. Henderson actually slightly more involved than Akers right now as a receiver. So kind of a sneakier buy probably than Cam Akers, the more high profile rookie is probably, you're going to have to pry him away a bit more. Robert Woods led the wide receivers here in routes run. He ran a route on 100% of dropbacks, had 39% of the targets, 46% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.9. Elite stuff here from Robert Woods. Has had a couple big games back-to-back now. A yards per route run here of 2.16. So a really strong game from Robert Woods. Went 7 for 80 on 12 targets. Cooper Kupp was the wide receiver 2, or at least the wide receiver 2 usually. He wasn't really actually this week. He ran a route on 89% of dropbacks, had a whopper of 0.35, which is a lot lower than I would have predicted. Yards per route run of 1.24, not very good. So just kind of a weak day from Cooper Kupp. And Josh Reynolds was more involved, actually. Ran a route on 100% of dropbacks, so getting the full slate of routes as he's kind of that clear outside wide receiver and the deep threat in this offense. He's kind of a fake deep threat because he's never really that high. His ADOT this week was 10.8, which is where he usually is. Most deep threats, are down much further downfield, sometimes 16, 17, 18, but, usually at least like 13. And yet Josh Reynolds was at 10.8. But again, this is like a feature of the Rams offense and Jared Goff where, the deepest guy barely gets over 10 yards downfield on his target. So Reynolds had a whopper of 0.47, which is pretty solid and a fair bit more than Cooper Kupp. Obviously, we have seen from Kupp, he can just get peppered with targets. So I'm not super worried about it. But, with Reynolds as involved as he is, it definitely lowers the floor for both Woods and Kupp. If Reynolds is going to be involved in that game, it kind of steals away from one of the other two. The nice thing is that Van Jefferson is not involved whatsoever. He does look like a bust at this point to me. I mean, I was pretty low on him in the first place, so I'm kind of more willing to say that. But he has just completely failed to pass Josh Reynolds in any way. I mean, at one point in the season early on, they were kind of splitting that role, and now Reynolds is running 100% of the routes. So Van Jefferson just seems to have kind of failed in his ability to get on the field. At tight end, we had Tyler Higbee maybe not playing in this game, but he did end up going, and he was out there for 49% of dropbacks. Everett was slightly ahead, running around on 51% of dropbacks, but Higbee was actually targeted at a higher rate. He did have a target per route run of 17% to Everett's 11%. I guess it really comes down to how you measure targets, because I think PFF only gave Everett one target, PFF gave Higbee 3 targets and Everett 2. The RotoViz data here gave them both 2. But basically, they had a dead even split again. And I was thinking that with Higbee's injury, that Everett might be out in front this week. That was not the case. So both guys kind of continuing to cannibalize each other. I thought we might get a week where Everett could really deliver some strong value with Higbee out. But once again, with both guys out there, they were really stealing from each other. In Miami, at running back, I mean, this was kind of a total mess here. Matt Breida started the game, but he lost a fumble, ended up only playing 32% of the snaps. Then we also had Patrick Laird lose a fumble. He ended up only playing 14% of the snaps, had less than a point in workload. Breida ended up with 5.9 points in expected point workload. DeAndre Washington played 48% of the snaps. He did not lose a fumble, but he did lose 6 points worth of efficiency, delivering only 8 points on an expected points workload of 14. Did not convert on 2 green zone carries. So I'm thinking that once Myles Gaskin is back, it's going to be the Myles Gaskin show. I guess we'd have to see how exactly it works out between him and Ahmed. But it's going to be such a mess if we don't get one of Ahmed or Gaskin this week. I think I would lean towards Washington just because he did get ultimately the almost half the snaps, and we've seen him operate pretty well in this role. But I've been kind of hoping for Washington to have some value this year so many times that it's a little bit hard to trust, or a little bit hard to even take a dart throw on. As we move to wide receiver, Devontae Parker had a route run on 98% of dropbacks. He had a target per route run of 31%. Really strong stuff from Devontae Parker with 36% of the targets, 51% of the air yards, a whopper of 0.9. An elite day out of Devontae Parker. He had 14 targets for 8 receptions and 119 yards. Didn't get in the end zone. Had a yards per route run of 2.83. Wasn't one of those crazy days that we saw from like Tyreek Hill and some of the other wide receivers this week where they're up in the 5, 6s, et cetera, for yards per outrun, but still a very strong day from Devontae Parker. And I do think, when he has Ryan Fitzpatrick and he doesn't really have anyone else to compete with now with Preston Williams down, and Jakeem Grant was actually a little bit banged up heading into this game. I mean, it just sets up so well for Parker. And I don't know if we'll get Ryan Fitzpatrick going forward. It sounds like we probably won't, but if we do, he is looking like he could potentially be a smash. Mac Hollins was kind of the wide receiver 2 in this game. As I mentioned, Jakeem Grant was banged up heading into the game, but Hollins had a yards per route run of 0.73. He was targeted only 12% of his routes. Route run percentage of 60% on his targets, weighted target per route run of 0.25, which is pretty poor. So not someone that really came off as all that interesting. Grant also did not come off as very interesting. He had 0.24 weighted targets per route run, running around 40% of dropbacks, and a yards per route run also below 1 of 0.88. So pretty weak day from him. We also then had Lynn Bowden mixed in, running around 26% of dropbacks. We had Antonio Callaway running around 21% of dropbacks. Malcolm Perry out there for 9%. None of these guys really popped. So I do think that it's Devontae Parker going forward. And if you want to take another shot on this offense, it's probably Mike Gesicki, who ran a route on 77% of dropbacks. He was only targeted, though, on 15% of his routes, which is kind of the Mike Gesicki profile. He runs a bit deeper than most tight ends with an ADOT of 10. That's typical for Mike Gesicki. He typically is kind of more of like a deep threat wide receiver than like a classic tight end. So his target per route run is always going to be a bit lower than most tight ends, especially like kind of the tight ends that we want to play. But, Mike Gesicki has also struggled to really have like a good yards per route run. He doesn't usually have a very good yards per target. So he's just kind of, I think he's someone that you can take a stab on. He did get in the end zone here, went 2 for 35 with a touchdown. But man, he's just so volatile. It is tough. But I mean, yeah, unless Jakeem Grant comes back pretty healthy this week, gets in full practice reports, that would be pretty interesting. And again, all these guys are so much less interesting without Ryan Fitzpatrick. So it might just ultimately be kind of a moot point, and maybe Devontae Parker goes back to being kind of a flex type dude without Ryan Fitzpatrick to buoy the offense. Moving to Minnesota. At running back, we had Devontae Parker set up for an absolutely smash game. Didn't really come to fruition here. He played 63% of the snaps, and that was reduced because he left the field with a potential injury. It looked like it might be really bad at first, but he did come back in the game. It wasn't ultimately that big of a deal. Have to keep an eye on practice reports to see, but so far it doesn't look too bad. But then Cook only got a workload of 14.8 points, partly because he wasn't out there all the time, but partly because of game script. Cook also lost a fumble. He did not convert his only green zone carry. So disappointing day out of Cook. And, he was kind of the mega chalk this week in DFS, and rightly so. I mean, just kind of set up as such a huge smash spot, but ultimately didn't work out. Had 61 yards and no scores on 18 attempts. Had 4 receptions and 21 receiving yards on 4 targets. So, it wasn't awful, I guess, but, it was kind of awful, frankly. Left 2.6 points on the field on an expected points workload of 14.8. So pretty tough. I would say that the other running backs weren't really involved. Alexander Madison only had an expected points workload of 1 and just 16% of snaps. So even with Madison exiting the game, even with Cook exiting the game for a while, did not have a ton of work from the other guys. At wide receiver, obviously Adam Thielen was also injured and out for this game. And so we had Justin Jefferson soaking up volume. You can see here on the chart, he is where we want to see our wide receiver ones, running a route on 98% of dropbacks, had a 30% target share, 35% air yard share, a nice whopper of 0.69, very much wide receiver one level whopper there, but wasn't super efficient actually in this game. Only a yards per target of 5.8, went 7 for 70 on 13 targets. However, got in the end zone twice. And I think it's kind of interesting because Adam Thielen opens up additional end zone targets for him. But I also think that Adam Thielen creates more defensive attention for Justin Jefferson. So a little bit of a double-edged sword right now for Justin Jefferson. Still a rookie. I still think probably benefits between the 20s from Adam Thielen being out there. But because Adam Thielen is such a big part of their red zone, their green zone passing game, not having him out there for those types of packages does create more of the touchdown ceiling for Jefferson. So kind of more, I think, a little bit of a spot where you're not probably going to see Jefferson pop off for as many of those huge plays without Adam Thielen able to draw attention, but probably gets in the end zone a little bit more with the 2 touchdowns here. Certainly seems like that's the case. Olabisi Johnson was out there as the wide receiver 2, running around 92% of dropbacks, had 16% of the targets, 90% of the air yards, and a whopper of 0.37. Chad Beebe was out there a fair amount as well, running around 59% of dropbacks. He was targeted at a really high rate, 24% of his routes, almost as high as Justin Jefferson, actually. He was at 25%. And Chad Beebe had a weighted target per route run of 0.54, which is pretty solid. Not a lead or anything, but a pretty solid weighted target per route run. So kind of interesting that he was so involved with Thielen out. Kyle Rudolph also was able to kind of soak up targets here. He was targeted on 18% of his routes, which is, a lot more than we would expect for Kyle Rudolph. Running around 78% of dropbacks, So taking advantage not just of Thielen being out, but Irv Smith being out, allowed Kyle Rudolph to have a pretty decent day, 7 for 68, which is certainly a lot more involved than Kyle Rudolph typically is. Moving to New England, we have Damian Harris kind of taking over this Sony Michel role. Damian Harris has played really well this season. He's running back 2 in PFF's rushing grades. He did leave a lot on the field here in terms of efficiency. He left 6.7 points on the field in efficiency. So a really rough day for him in terms of fantasy points over expectation. But that's because he got 3 green zone carries that he did not convert. He had an expected points workload of 11.4. He had 14 rushing attempts for 47 yards and was not targeted. So all in all, pretty disappointing day for Harris, but got 64% of the snaps. Sony Michel was back in this game and got just 2%. So in that respect, it was a bit bullish to see him so far ahead of Sony Michel. James White was the other guy mixing in here, and James White got 2 green zone carries, and he converted both of those. Obviously, a little bit fluky, I think, to see James White even getting those 2 carries, and then obviously going 2 for 2. Not quite the James White profile, but 5 for 18, 2 touchdowns, only 1 target. So kind of a weird game in terms of the usage for James White. At wide receiver, Jakobi Meyers was back to being the wide receiver 1 here. It was kind of a weird total failure last week after several strong weeks in terms of the underlying volume for Meyers, and back to the strong underlying volume here, running around on 100% of dropbacks. He had 35% of the targets, 43% of the air yards, really strong wide receiver 1 level whopper of 0.83, and a yards per route run of 2.48, which is pretty good. That's pretty damn good. So Jakobi Meyers kind of returning back to what we were hoping we'd continue to see out of him. But Damiere Byrd, even more impressive. And this week he ran slightly less routes, 90% of dropbacks, but 41% target share, which was more than Meyers, 46% air yards, which is more than Meyers, and a whopper of 0.94, which is even better than Meyers, and a weighted target per route run of 0.91, which is an elite number and much better than Meyers, since Meyers is out there for 100% compared to 90% for Byrd. So pretty strong day from Byrd. Byrd early on in the season was running a ton of routes. He was the guy who was always out there running 100% of routes, even more than N'Keal Harry, even more than Julian Edelman, but he wasn't getting targeted. And that started to change. He started to get targets over the last few weeks. And so he's starting to be someone that I'm a little bit more interested in. Still not all that heavily targeted on the entire year, a whopper of 0.5 this season. But, that's not terrible. And so in the right situations, could be someone worth targeting or worth sprinkling in or whatever. N'Keal Harry here, well behind Meyers and Byrd, running a route on 52% of dropbacks, had 18% of the targets, 17% of the air yards, and a whopper of 0.38. Somewhat involved on a weighted target per route run basis of 0.44, target on 18% of his routes. Not terrible numbers, but not great numbers either. Not certainly the type of numbers that would lead to a changing of the guard here. I think Meyers and Byrd are pretty locked in ahead of him in terms of just being out there on the field. And if that's the case, both Meyers and Byrd can have pretty significant roles because in addition to Harry not drawing targets at a super high rate, we do not have a tight end to worry about here. Ryan Izzo running a route on 71% of dropbacks and was not targeted. Moving to New Orleans, this Taysom Hill thing is kind of killing Alvin Kamara's value. He played 48% of the snaps. Latavius Murray played 47%. I think that Latavius Murray probably benefited from the big win here, but I think he also probably benefits from Taysom Hill as the quarterback leads to, more like rushing, more of the pure rusher type, potentially benefiting, and the guy who's the receiving threat, not quite as featured. Alvin Kamara here had only 2 targets. Latavius Murray had 1. And as a result, Kamara had an expected points workload of just 7.7. He left 1.5 of that on the field. Murray had an expected points workload of 12.7. He added 12.9 points to that. He got in the end zone twice. One of those was on one of his 4 green zone carries. So pretty nice day here from Latavius Murray. Obviously, you can't expect that this is going to be such a good day for Latavius Murray going forward. But man, it's just when you got a guy like Kamara who is such a big part of the short passing game, and then you bring in a quarterback who just basically doesn't throw past his first read, you're just going to see a huge reduction in the potential scoring for Alvin Kamara. So this has been pretty tough for Alvin Kamara owners. Pete and I have him in the first main event team that we drafted. We're going to be in the championship game with that team, but I don't know how much we'll get at Alvin Kamara for the championship game. At wide receiver, Michael Thomas ran a route on 64% of dropbacks. Target per route run at 43%, which is absurd. Target share of 43%, area yard share of 76%, Whopper of 1.18. I mean, this is that first read. Every time Taysom Hill drops back, he's looking for Michael Thomas. If he doesn't see Michael Thomas, he's either running or he's very rarely throwing to anyone else. And so the other guys just aren't really that interesting. Whopper of 0.09 for Traquan Smith, Whopper of 0.13 for Emmanuel Sanders. Just pretty gross. And then at the tight end position, you've got Jared Cook, who's basically in the process of losing his job to Adam Troutman. And Josh Hill was also involved here, running around on 27% of dropbacks, which is kind of strange. But yeah, Cook was at 36%, Troutman at 32%. Jared Cook did get a decent target per route run of 25%. He had no receptions though. So just got a couple targets basically that didn't catch. It looks nice because it was a small sample, but yeah, there's really no one but Michael Thomas here you can trust in the receiving game, and Alvin Kamara hopefully gets a bigger share of the rushing work in more competitive environments, and hopefully very soon. Moving to the Giants, we've got Wayne Gallman here, who's making a case for himself as the running back one here, even as Devonta Freeman likely comes back soon. He played 63% of the snaps, had 28.7 expected points. Really strong day from him from the workload perspective. 24 carries, 5 targets, 4 green zone carries. Got in the end zone once. Went 3 for -3 as a receiver. So ended up leaving 10.6 points on the field. So that's pretty tough. But, did score at least that one time. Had 94 yards on 24 carries, which I guess isn't terrible. Here's the thing. We've got Devonta Freeman coming back. We also just lost Daniel Jones. So it's going to be a lot harder to ever want to play Wayne Gallman going forward. It looks like he was kind of locking up that role, or the team was starting to lean on him. But at this point, it might not even matter who the lead running back is here. And it also is going to hurt the wide receivers to have Colt McCoy. Sterling Shepard had been kind of a high floor play recently, but no one's going to be a high floor play now with Colt McCoy back there. Shepard ran a route on 95% of dropbacks here, target share of 22%, area share of 26%, and a Whopper of 0.5. So kind of decent numbers, not great numbers, and it's only going to get worse, I think. Darius Slayton actually goose-egged here. He had 2 targets, 0 receptions, targeted on only 6% of his routes. He had an 8 out of 32, which is just fucking crazy. Ran a route on 77% of dropbacks, so wasn't out there all the time. Golden Tate was actually out there more, running around 81% of dropbacks, and he had a Whopper of 0.53, which actually led all of the wide receivers. So kind of strange usage overall. And again, you basically can't trust any of these guys, including Evan Ingram, who's finally looking like he was maybe breaking out a little bit, breaking out of certainly this low ADOT usage. He was up to 11.9 this week, which is pretty cool to see. He's an athletic dude. It's cool to see him used down the field. Had a Whopper of 0.6, which is pretty damn good for a tight end, running around on 86% of dropbacks, which is elite for a tight end, targeted on 24% of his routes, which is very good. Basically elite for a tight end. 14.3 yards per target. Yards per route run of 3.49. Went 6 for 129 yards on 9 targets. He lost a fumble in this game, but outside of that, it was awesome. And I think we're losing it now, though, because we have Colt McCoy. So it's going to be a bit of a bummer going forward. But, if Daniel Jones comes back from this hamstring quicker than expected, then I do think that, you could be looking at a better profile for Evan Ingram, who seems to have broken out a little bit of this kind of gross low A usage that we'd seen to start the year. Moving to the Jets, speaking of gross, we've got a running back situation here that's just sort of mind-blowing, with Frank Gore getting 58% of the snaps and 11.6 expected points to Ty Johnson, 18% of the snaps and 4.3 expected points. Ty Johnson did leave 2.9 points on the field, so he didn't really make a case for that to change. Ty Johnson being used basically as an exclusive passing down type of guy with a route run on 70% of his snaps, which is really, really high for a running back. Basically a pure passing down specialist. Frank Gore getting like the full workload in terms of the actual traditional running back stuff. It's Adam Gase. I don't know what to tell you. At wide receiver, we've got Brashad Perriman and Denzel Mims operating as the 1-2 again, even with Sam Darnold back. So that was pretty nice to see. We've got 26% target. 26% target per route run for both Mims and Brashad Perriman. A whopper of 0.74 for Perriman and 0.69 for Mims. Perriman was used a bit deeper downfield at 16.9 and Mims at 13.6. You can see right here on the chart, kind of doing these guys together, and they were both overlapping on the chart. They had very, very similar days in terms of the underlying volume, and they also had very, very good days in terms of the underlying volume, and both were fairly efficient. Brashad Perriman with 2.55 yards per route run, Denzel Mims with 2.19 yards per route run. So pretty strong days from both these guys. I was pretty bearish on what their roles would look like with the return of Sam Darnold, but this was nice. I hope this continues. Jamison Crowder will probably end up kind of ruining this, or if you own Jamison Crowder, you would say getting back in the mix, but ran a route on 91% of dropbacks, so was certainly on the field quite a bit in this game, but only had a target per route run of 17%, weighted target per route run of 0.44, much lower than 0.79 for Perriman and 0.72 for Mims. So, definitely could be getting more targets, but I doubt we're going to see him get back to where he was early in the season, where he's just getting those massive target shares. That seems to be a thing of the past with Mims coming on and Perriman healthy. And Chris Herndon, he is way ahead of Ryan Griffin at this point at tight end, but neither guy was targeted. 44% of routes run per dropback for Herndon, but frankly, who cares? Moving to the Philadelphia Eagles, this stretch of teams has just been getting grosser and grosser, with the Eagles just flatlining. And Miles Sanders is also kind of flatlining on us. He had a snap share of 61% to Boston Scott's 37%, something I pointed out last week, where he is not getting that elite snap share that I thought we could count on. We had shown it earlier in the season. He had shown that he's kind of potentially this elite workhorse running back. And now moving into this 60-40 type split with Boston Scott. Not great. In fact, Boston Scott had 10.2 expected points to Miles Sanders 7.7. So Boston Scott, the actual kind of more valuable workload here, and that's because he is the passing down back. Route run per snap of 85%. When he's out there, they're often throwing, and that allowed him to get 6 targets, 5 receptions, and 40 yards. Miles Sanders only had 2 receptions for 7 yards on 3 targets. Miles Sanders was out there for more routes, 47% of the dropbacks this week to Boston Scott's 40. But when Boston Scott's on the field, just much more likely they're passing, Boston Scott being used in that kind of passing down specialist role. And this was a game where they're trailing, and that's going to be something that we need to get used to with the Eagles. This team looks completely out of sorts. Wentz looks completely out of sorts. So right now, can't really rely on Miles Sanders to get the full workhorse workload whatsoever. At wide receiver, Jalen Reagor did lead the outside wide receivers in routes run with a route run per dropback of 58%. That's a pretty gross routes run per dropback. Would have liked to see that much higher. We saw 55% for Alshon Jeffrey, 49% for Travis Fulgham. So those two kind of cannibalizing each other. And then we saw Jonathan Hightower at 29%. He's kind of cannibalizing Jalen Reagor. Reagor also kind of mixing in with everybody. It's like basically Fulgham, Hightower, Jeffrey, and Reagor are all kind of sharing that outside role. of the outside wide receivers, you'd have to say that Reagor had the strongest day, although it's really weird to say that because although he was targeted on 22% of his routes, which is good, he had a yards per target of 1.6, which is disgusting. He had a yards per route run, therefore, a 3.4, but Alshon Jeffrey was at 0.5 yards per route run. Travis Fulgham was at 0.59. John Hightower was at 0.08. This is terrible stuff. But all the other wide receivers besides Jalen Reagor, who, again, target per route run of 22%, weighted target per route run of 0.55, those are both pretty good numbers. The other guys were really bad shape. Alshon Jeffrey was at 13% target per route run, weighted target per route run of 0.35. Jonathan Hightower was at 8% target per route run, 0.15 weighted target per route run. No, so I'm sorry. Jonathan Hightower was at 6% target route run and a 0.09 weighted target per route run. Travis Fulgham was at 7% target per route run and a 0.17 weighted target per route run. I'm not sure exactly why I saved Greg Ward for last, but I did. He did lead the team or lead the wide receivers in routes run per drop back at 65%. But he was also gross in terms of the getting targets part. He had 8% target per route run and a 0.15 weighted target per route run, and he also had a yards per target of just 1, even worse than Reagor. So really, really gross stuff here overall from the wide receivers. And let's see Jalen Hurts, man. Let's see him. Let's see Jalen Hurts. I don't understand at this point why we wouldn't. There's all this stuff about, Wentz's contract, and they're going to have to. But, dude, you just spent a second-round pick on Jalen Hurts. Put him out there. Let's see what we got, because Carson Wentz looks broken. Carson Wentz looks like, he's just missing wide-open dudes. He double clutches even when he's checking down. It's bizarre. And I think that, they had him throwing, they opened up the season against Washington with all these offensive line injuries, and they're just having him throw into this pass rush that's getting to him. And I don't know, whatever. Now I'm sounding like a tape guy, but it's just it's hard to really imagine Carson Wentz just kind of bouncing back and playing through this. I kind of maybe benching him for a couple games is the best thing for Carson Wentz. Maybe he's able to come back and, put together a nice little run here to close out the last few games or something. But at this point, it's probably better for the wide receivers if we get Jalen Hurts. And I'm just kind of sick of watching Carson Wentz, frankly. Dallas Goedert was basically the wide receiver 1 in this game. Ran a route on 96% of dropbacks. See him here on the chart. I mean, almost where we want to see the wide receiver 1s. He did not get targeted at quite high enough rate, 19% target per route run, but that's pretty solid for a tight end. And paired with the route run percentage, he had a whopper of 0.59, which is pretty much elite for a tight end. So good stuff from Dallas Goedert at least. Didn't have the yards per target we want. Yards per route run of only 1.42. Not ideal, but, there's not too many tight end options. And when you go 7 for 75 and a touchdown at tight end, we're not complaining this year. So at least we have Dallas Goedert doing pretty good in this offense. Hopefully Zach Ertz doesn't come back and kill that. At San Francisco, another kind of hard to distinguish split here where we have Raheem Mostert with 40% of the snaps, Jeff Wilson with 35%, and Jerick McKinnon at 25%. The expected point workload tilted towards Mostert, who had 10.9 expected points to 5.5 for Jeff Wilson and 5.9 for Jerick McKinnon. Mostert did score on the 1 green zone carry for the entire backfield. He did lose a fumble, but so did Jeff Wilson. I think, McKinnon is the guy that when this team gets behind, he's going to have pretty nice games. He had 41% route run per dropback, which is quite a bit higher than either of the other two guys, and he ran a route on 83% of his snaps. So he was pretty involved. We know this, that Jerick McKinnon is the kind of clear receiving running back, but interesting, with Mostert back, we had seen Mostert more involved as a receiver than we had expected to start the season. He did get 2 targets here, but I do think that McKinnon will, be a decent dart throw when they're in the passing game scripts. And I would think that Mostert ends up working more back into his typical role. He could end up kind of taking back most of this stuff from Jeff Wilson, getting up into the more 65% snap count range. And at that point, he would be more interesting, hopefully staying well above 10 expected points and, getting into that 15 expected points range for Raheem Mostert going forward. At wide receiver, we had a nice day here from Deebo Samuel, who went 11 for 133, did not get in the end zone, but, got 13 targets, so very heavily involved. Ran around on 92% of dropbacks, had a target per route run of 38%, target share of 38%, air yard share of 6%. Look at this little tiny bubble for Deebo Samuel. He's so shallowly targeted. This happens every week. I was talking with Ben Gretch about this on Friday, and it's like, wait, seriously? Is the ADOT here for Deebo Samuel right? It looks like it's below 2. No, it was right. And this week he was at 0.6. He's now got a season-long ADOT of 1.7. So, Deebo Samuel, this is just kind of the way they use him. He gets targeted a lot, but he gets targeted really, really shallowly. On the flip side, we have Richie James, who was targeted very, very deep. He had an ADOT of 23. He was targeted on just 3% of his routes, only got one target on all of his routes. Ran around on 95% of dropbacks, got 35 routes, just one target. I do think this is the role that Brandon Ayuk is coming back to. I think Ayuk is going to be involved in this Richie James role, but just getting a lot more targets because he's way better than Richie James. And so once Ayuk gets back, you would imagine that Samuel is probably in the exact same role we've seen him in all season, but that Ayuk might be the more valuable of the two because he's going to get the air yards to go with a lot more targets than Richie James was able to earn. River Craft ran around on just 3% of dropbacks in this game, and Kendrick Bourne was the wide receiver 3, running around on 70% of dropbacks, but got targeted on 15% of his routes with an 8 out of 6. So not great stuff there from Bourne. The offense would definitely benefit when Ayuk's back. Jordan Reed had a pretty nice role here. He ran a route on 68% of dropbacks, target per route run of 24%, 8 out of 14, pretty high for a tight end. Target share of 18%, air yard share 59%, elite whopper of 0.68. I think he's probably to some extent soaking up some of the Brandon Ayuk type volume, but I also think this is a team that likes throwing to the tight end. So Jordan Reed, very, very strong volume here. Don't be fooled by the 3 yards per target that kept his day just to 2 for 18. I think that Jordan Reed could have much stronger days ahead, particularly if we don't end up getting Brandon Ayuk back this week. The 6 targets for Jordan Reed is pretty nice. The 24% target per route run for Jordan Reed is very nice. He's out there running a fair amount of routes. So good stuff from Jordan Reed. Definitely a bullish day for him. He looks like a pretty strong tight end play, much stronger than his raw volume would indicate. Ross Dwelly was out there for 27% of dropbacks, target per route run of 20%. So not terrible, but definitely firmly behind Jordan Reed. Moving to Seattle. At running back, we have Carlos Hyde playing much more ahead of Chris Carson than I would have expected. He got 61% of the snaps to 37% for Chris Carson. And Carlos Hyde also led in the expected points workload with 14.4 expected points to Chris Carson's 9.5. Carlos Hyde got 2 green zone carries to Chris Carson's 1. Chris Carson nor Carlos Hyde scored on any of those 3 green zone carries, but Carson did get in the end zone with a really nice touchdown run from outside the green zone. He went 8 for 41 and a touchdown to Hyde's 15 for 22. You would think, given that production, that they are probably working Carson back, somewhat slowly, so he gets closer to full health. His role will continue to grow. I do think that's probably the case. I don't think Carlos Hyde's going away, but I think that eventually we're going to see kind of the 65-35 type split here, maybe 70-30 type split favoring Carson. We'll see. We did not really get anything out of the other backs. DJ Dallas was active, but no offensive snaps. So it was just these 2 running backs this week for Seattle. Moving to wide receiver, DK Metcalf. Look at this bubble on the chart. Sam Hoppin told me he actually had to resize his limits for the air yards because we never thought that a dude would be getting this much of an air yards percentage, 82.1% air yards this week. He ran a route on 86% of dropbacks. So he did not even run a full slate of routes. Just out there on 86% of dropbacks. He was targeted on 43% of his routes. He accounted for 43% of the targets, 82% of the air yards, a whopper of 1.23. This is a scale that's supposed to go to 1. He had a 1.23. He had a weighted targets per route run of 1.3, which is absurd. Yards per target of 13.6. So he was efficient on his volume. Even with that drop touchdown, which was obviously a bummer for his owners, he was still smashing in terms of his per target efficiency, yards per route run of 5.9. He had 207 air yards, 13 targets for 10 receptions, and 177 yards. This guy is a beast. And I think, just a reminder that these dudes who end up being athletic freaks and end up being studs, they hit sooner than you think, right? So, yeah, was Tyler Lockett like a little bit safer than DK Metcalf? Yeah, he definitely was. But the ceiling that DK Metcalf has is just wild. Obviously, we've seen Tyler Lockett pop off for some huge games. Entering this game, it's like, do I play Tyler Lockett? He could have this massive 50-point game. Do I play DK Metcalf? He could have this huge game. But I do think that ultimately DK Metcalf is the bigger threat here. And the Seahawks think so too. They had him in one-on-one coverage this game. That's why he popped off. They just kept going to him. When they've got the matchup for DK Metcalf, they're using it. When they don't have the matchup, then you see Tyler Lockett become a bigger part of the offense. And Tyler Lockett, it wasn't a terrible game. He ran around on 91% of dropbacks. He had 13% target per route run, though, so not targeted at a super high rate. But again, they're just feeding DK Metcalf in this game. Target share of 13%, area share of 9%. But the silver lining here for Tyler Lockett is that it really is him and DK Metcalf running all the routes. And he actually ran the most routes on the team. David Moore only ran around on 46% of dropbacks. Freddie Swain only on 29%, and he wasn't even targeted. David Moore did score a touchdown, but had 3 targets in this game, so not a huge part of the offense. Actually had -6 yards on the whole. So this was a good game, a good reminder that this still is concentrated to the top 2 guys. Even when one of them pops off, it does not really hurt the chances of the other guy popping off if things break a little differently in terms of the matchup, in terms of the defensive attention. The Seahawks basically have this situation where they can make you choose who's going to kill you. Is it DK Metcalf or is it Tyler Lockett? I think it's easier for DK Metcalf to kill people because he's just so goddamn big and fast. But Tyler Lockett can certainly do it as well if the defense gives too much attention to DK Metcalf. Tyler Lockett will make them pay. Moving to tight end here, we've got Jacob Hollister. He ran a route on 60% of dropbacks, had a 24% target per route run, which is pretty solid. He got 5 targets in this game, which is not bad, but he only went 2 for 11, a yards per target of 2.2. Pretty gross in that regard. A yards per route run of 0.52, which is pretty gross too. But hey, he got the 24% target per route run, and he's out there right around where we start to feel comfortable with the tight end play. So Jacob Hollister, I do think, is someone that with Greg Olsen out now, you can play. I mean, you can basically consider him your tight end starter after this game. Getting the 24% target per route run, we had Will Dissly not get a target in this game. He did run around on 60% of dropbacks, but was not targeted. Hopefully that comes down a little bit from Will Dissly. Hopefully, Hollister is up closer to 70%, at least around 65%. Dissly coming down closer to 50%. And that would mean maybe an extra target for Hollister. And that'd be a pretty nice profile for him, getting those targets from Russell Wilson. Moving to Tampa Bay, at running back, we've got, the snap split that I don't love. Leonard Fournette, 56% of the snaps. Ronald Jones, 36% of the snaps. However, the production was not tilted that way. Even though Leonard Fournette had the bigger workload of 7.8 expected points, because Leonard Fournette is bad, he left 2.8 points on the field. He did not score or convert or even get positive yards in total on a green zone carry and green zone target. Ronald Jones did get in the end zone despite not getting any usage in the green zone. He had 1 reception for 37 yards and a touchdown. He also had 9 attempts for 66 yards. He added 10.6 points to his expected points workload. He had a workload, though, of just 6.7 points. So the usage here is frustrating. Now, there was the Roto-World report that Arians had said Ronald Jones needs to get 20 touches. Now, Ian Hartitz immediately put together a collage of all the times Arians has lied to us, and he is exactly right. Arians is a liar. We can't trust this. But it's actually worse than that because, I mean, you knew I did this before. I don't even have to tell you, but I went and watched the presser. Obviously, I watched the presser. I watched Arians talk about it. Here's what happened. There's a frustrated beat writer who's like, basically, as if I was asking the question, like, why is Ronald Jones not getting more playing time? The dude looks awesome. He looks so much better than Leonard Fournette. Why did he only have 9 attempts? Why is he out there for so few snaps? Why are you playing Leonard Fournette? You have to give this dude more work, right? And Arians said, I don't think there's any doubt that we need to give Jones more work when you don't have to be in the 2-minute drill for an entire quarter. That's what he said. I don't think there's any doubt we need to give this guy more work when we're not down 3 scores. He said, when we're down 3 scores, you got to put your best pass catcher in the game. He was talking about Leonard Fournette. Then he went on to talk about how Ronald Jones has probably earned some more pass catching work. And then he said, basically when we're in the right game script, he's got to get 20 touches. So the whole 20 touches thing isn't even like, I need to give this dude 20 touches, period. It was, I would like to be in a position to give this guy 20 touches. So on top of being a liar, it's also, there was a caveat to it, an important caveat to it that basically means that we're going to continue very likely to see this game script dependent usage for Ronald Jones. Now they are entering the bye, so it's possible the roles change. Arians kind of alluded to the fact that maybe they should change, although it kind of felt like he was just trying to throw the reporter a bone. But there is an argument that it shouldn't change. I will say Ronald Jones, despite being 5th in PFF's rushing grades among running backs, he is last in their receiving grades. So he has not been a good receiver this year. However, Jones has a yards per route run of 0.99 to Leonard Fournette's 1.04. So they're basically right there. Neither one has been good in the receiving game overall. And it's hard to argue that Jones doesn't add a more explosive element to the receiving game, as we saw on that explosive 37-yard reception, as we saw somewhat last year when he actually had a good yards per route run because he's effective in the screen game. He sometimes looks a little bit like a chicken with his head cut off on the check down stuff. I think that's probably why he's not out there so much in the 3rd down and the 2-minute drill stuff. So there's a chance that the roles change, but I actually probably don't think they do. I would like to see it change, but I think we're still seeing Jones in a very game script dependent role out of the bye, most likely. That just kind of is what it is. I'd love to see it change, but I probably think it doesn't change. Leonard Fournette continues to kind of fail in this low volume version of basically what he was in last year, where he's getting a lot of kind of dump off stuff, doesn't really do much with it. So, obviously you're not playing Leonard Fournette. He's just kind of ruining what could be a really nice stretch run for Ronald Jones. If Ronald Jones gets in good game scripts down the stretch, though, very happy to plug him in 2 lineups. At wide receiver, this is another kind of messy situation where we have Mike Evans running around on 93% of dropbacks, Chris Godwin on 90%, and we at least had a strong game for Mike Evans here with 22% of the targets, 38% of the air yards, and a whopper of 0.6. That's pretty good, kind of wide receiver-ish, 1-ish level type stuff. Poor yards per target, though, of 5.6, so leading to a yards per route run of 1.28, but got in the end zone twice, 3 for 50 and 2 scores on 9 targets. This is kind of a ceiling game for Mike Evans this year. It's a bit of a bummer, but I think this is where we're at with Tom Brady at quarterback. Chris Godwin, he did have 22% of the targets, 22% of the air yards. Decent whopper, not great whopper, decent of 0.48. He went 8 for 97 with a pretty strong yards per target of 10.8 and pretty strong yards per route run of 2.55. So relied a little bit on per target efficiency to get there. Didn't have the strongest underlying volume, but it wasn't terrible. And you see him here on the chart. He was where we wanted to see. So, the 24% target per route run, but he was only out there for 90% of dropbacks. Would like to see him up a little bit higher. Antonio Brown was less involved this week, a target per route run of 10%. He was targeted on such a high rate entering this week and really came down this week. He hasn't been good. His yards per target again was bad at 3.7. So it's probably a good thing that he wasn't targeted at such a high rate. Went 2 for 11 on 3 targets. So just a total dud from Antonio Brown. We'll be curious to see if he gets any less playing time. He ran around on 74% of dropbacks. Scotty Miller was at 19%. I wonder if that starts to creep back towards Miller a bit. We'll have to see. Tyler Johnson was also out there a little bit, running around on 7% of dropbacks, but is an afterthought. Rob Gronkowski ran around on 64% of dropbacks. Really nice target per route run of 26%. And pretty deep ADOT of 10.6. Really strong per target efficiency of 15.1 and had a yards per route run of 3.93. So really strong stuff from Gronk this week with 6 for 106 on 7 targets. Probably a ceiling game, probably a spike week for Gronk, but nice to see that he can do that. Cameron Brate actually could have had a really nice game this week. He had a route run percentage of 48%, target per route run of 30%. Really, really strong stuff there. But yards per target of 5.7. And so went 4 for 34 on 6 targets. Not terrible, but, not ideal either. Moving to Tennessee. At running back, we have Derrick Henry with a ceiling game that could have even been bigger. He had 64% of the snaps. He had 22.1 expected points and then it added 16.4 points to that. He had 3 touchdowns. He could have had 4 because there was what'll go down basically is just a Ryan Tannehill rush, but it was a read option play where he could have handed it off to Derrick Henry, and basically the entire defense went that way. So he just took himself for an easy score. But you're watching that ball in Derrick Henry's gut for what could have been a 4th touchdown. I think this could just be an absurd day. He got 2 green zone rushes and scored one of them, meaning 2 of the touchdowns came outside the green zone, and he had 27 rushing attempts for 178 yards on top of the 3 touchdowns. He also had 4 targets in this game. Only went 2 for 7, but the 4 targets is pretty nice to see. Not what we would expect typically from Derrick Henry. And he ran a route on 54% of dropbacks, so pretty involved in terms of being out there at least. Jeremy McNichols only stole 1 target. He stole 25% of the snaps, 5.3 expected points. He left 3.3 expected points, 3.3 points on the field on his 5.3 expected points workload. Deontay Foreman only out there for 7% of the snaps, only got 2 expected points. I am starting to get to the point where I consider McNichols to be the handcuff here. Granted, Foreman is kind of the Derrick Henry clone, but McNichols is playing so clearly ahead of him, and McNichols not being involved all that much as a receiver actually, makes me wonder if he is kind of the more direct backup to Henry. McNichols with 8 attempts here to Foreman's 4. So McNichols is used as a rusher fairly extensively, even more so than Foreman. Excuse me. At wide receiver, we have A.J. Brown running around on 83% of dropbacks, but targeted on 30% of his routes. This dude is a beast. Obviously, you already knew that, but come on. He's such a beast. Looking here on the chart, he is exactly where we want to see guys, except that he's not out there for quite as many routes as we like. But with the 37.3% air yards combined with the 30% target share, we got a 0.72 Whopper, which is pretty good. 0.74 weighted target per route run, which is pretty good. We have a 16.3 yards per target because it's A.J. Brown. The 4.9 yards per route run is absurd. Obviously, that's going to regress. We can't count on that week to week, but we kind of can because it's A.J. Brown. We got 4 for 98 and a touchdown on 6 targets. So A.J. Brown just doing A.J. Brown stuff this week. Really, really strong stuff. Would like to see him obviously out there for more routes, but no Titans wide receiver was out there for more routes than A.J. Brown this week. Corey Davis was at 75% of routes per dropback. Used his kind of a deep threat this week and had 15% target share and 32% of the air yards, a Whopper of 0.45. Really strong yards per target, actually, as well as Brown. Davis was very efficient. He had a 3.89 yards per route run and a 23.3 yards per target. He went 3 for 70 on 3 targets. Again, this really efficient but low volume passing attack that's kind of carried over from last year. And that's what happens when you just can't stop Derrick Henry. Then they can pass off of that. They can have Ryan Tannehill rush off of that. Everything can come off of that and be highly efficient in the play action game, the zone read game, whatever. Once the defense is just literally in fear every time Derrick Henry gets the ball, you can do so much off of it. I think that's part of the reason the wide receivers had such a big day. At tight end, Jonnu Smith did not get targeted. Anthony Firkser did not get targeted. And Jeff Swaim got targeted. So it was kind of weird. I don't really know what to make of it. Anthony Firkser actually did get targeted once, according to Rotoviz, but it looks like according to PFF, he did not. So one of those discrepancies on the target numbers that sometimes you see with PFF. But either way, Jeff Swaim was the only guy who all platforms agree was targeted in this game. He had 3 targets for 3 receptions and 30 yards. I didn't really think Jeff Swaim was going to be a thing, but, targeted on 33% of his routes. Jonnu Smith only ran around on 54% of dropbacks. Anthony Firkser, 38. Jeff Swaim, 38 as well. So certainly Firkser now becomes someone that we're not that interested in if Swaim's going to be involved, and it really, really lowers Jonnu Smith's floor if he can have games where he doesn't even get a target. Moving to Washington, where we will close it out. Antonio Gibson, really nice week for Antonio Gibson. Got the 3 touchdowns, got the 115 yards rushing, 20 attempts. Really, really strong stuff. Also had 7 targets for 5 receptions and 21 receiving yards. Really strong stuff. Had 65% of the snaps, which was great to see. Had a 22.1 expected points workload, which is elite, which is great to see. Added elite efficiency on top of that with 14.5 points over expectation, which is great to see. Had the 3 green zone carries. Had 1 green zone target. Only converted 1 of those, which kind of points to the fact that he had these huge long runs, right? Because he made up for the inefficiency of only taking 4 carries inside 4 opportunities inside the 10-yard line and turning that into 1 touchdown. But he also got 2 touchdowns from outside the 10-yard line, which is obviously not to be expected. So Antonio Gibson with a really strong day, getting used pretty extensively as a receiver. You can see him here on the chart where he's getting targeted at a really high rate, which is kind of cool. Don't always see that level of targeting from the running backs. 37% target per route run this week. So all of this stuff, very, very bullish. Love to see it. However, we do have J.D. McKissic getting 41% of the snaps still. Did still steal 5.1 expected points. Peyton Barber also stole 5.5 expected points. Neither of those guys was very efficient, but just a reminder that Gibson's floor remains low if the game script doesn't go the way this game did, where they're able to lean on Gibson. I think Gibson, as long as the game script's competitive, he can still be very strong. But if the game script goes to where they're needing to be in this, full-blown passing situation, it can get pretty tough for Antonio Gibson. So I'm still not convinced that we're going to get this type of workload every week. But, man, really nice to see it. Talked about this a few weeks back where Antonio Gibson, there is this target volume available in this backfield. If Antonio Gibson can get more of it, he can have these elite workloads. This week, he did get more of it with the 7 targets, and he did have an elite workload. At wide receiver, Terry McLaurin had a route run on 94% of dropbacks, target per route run of 31%, which is elite, obviously. Target share of 38%, air yard share of 77%, a whopper of 1.1. Really, really strong stuff from Terry McLaurin. He has the potential to absolutely smash if they're passing a lot. It's kind of like the opposite of Antonio Gibson, where he needs slightly different game scripts for Washington to be, passing a ton. The type of game scripts where you might see J.D. McKissic a lot more than Antonio Gibson. You could have Terry McLaurin absolutely blow up because he's getting such a big slice of this Washington receiving game. They do have Seattle in week 15, which, you look ahead to that thinking, man, I can't wait to get Terry McLaurin into my lineups for that. We do have him in the main event team where we have locked up a spot in that main event, the championship playoff. So definitely excited about what he can help do for our team there in week 15. But we do have Pittsburgh and San Francisco before that, not exactly lining up for the smash spots probably. But, when you're getting this big a slice of the offense, you can have big days even in non-perfect game scripts. He did go 7 for 92 here. He add a touchdown to that or something and could have been a much bigger day. And there's just no one really to compete with here. Cam Sims did not get targeted while running 22 routes. Isaiah Wright did not get targeted while running 11 routes. Then you've got these slot guys, Dontrell Inman and Steven Sims. They were basically splitting the role, but they did the same thing. They got targeted each on 13% of their routes, which is not good. So there's just no one to compete with here. And then Logan Thomas, even though he's out there all the time, which is nice, for Logan Thomas owners, it's like, yeah, it's good. He's a tight end. He's running around on 94% of dropbacks. That's pretty rare. It's an elite route share for a tight end, but only 14% target per route run, only 17% target share. So just not really competing with Terry McLaurin at all. Basically, Terry McLaurin was competing with Antonio Gibson for targets this week. That was the guy who had the second highest target share on the team. And that's why Terry McLaurin just ate up the air yard share, almost a DK Metcalfian air yard share this week. So really awesome to see for Terry McLaurin, and can't wait to see him in spots where he can fully take advantage. That'll do it this week for stat chasing. Make sure to check out ship chasing, which will actually not be this week on we will not be doing that on Wednesday this week. We will be doing that this week. We will be doing it on Thursday because of the Wednesday game, the Baltimore Steelers game. That is going to push us back a day. So check us out on 10 p.m. Thursday, and then check us out the following day. Me and Ben will be doing Chasing Signals on this channel at 4 p.m. Eastern. So subscribe, like, do all the things. Check us out on the podcast if you prefer to just listen to this. And that'll do it for this week. I will see you guys on Thursday.